Picture this. You're 1 week away from your dream wedding. 200 guests. The perfect dress. The man you love waiting at the altar. But as you walk past your parents' room, you hear voices that make your blood run cold. "She'll be standing up there like the pathetic failure she's always been," my mother hissed. 200 people will finally see what we've always known. My sister Sophie's laugh was pure venom. "I've already prepared her precious dress. One little pull during her speech and it'll fall apart completely. She'll be standing there in her underwear while everyone watches." They were planning to destroy me. On my wedding day, in front of everyone I cared about. For 28 years, I'd been the disappointment. The ordinary office worker overshadowed by my brilliant fashion designer sister. They thought I was weak, forgettable, someone they could humiliate without consequences. They had no idea who I really was. I just smiled, walked to my room, and made one phone call. Because what my family didn't know what they were about to discover in the most spectacular way possible is that their failure daughter had been hiding a secret that would change everything. By the end of this story, you'll witness the most satisfying wedding day revenge ever executed. Sophie's sabotage will backfire so magnificently that she'll become the laughingstock instead of me. My parents' cruelty will be exposed in front of 200 witnesses, and the shocking truth about who I really am will leave everyone's jaws on the floor. Trust me, karma has never been more beautiful than what you're about to see. My name is Emily Chen. I'm 28 years old, and for the past 6 years I've worked as an administrative coordinator at Henderson & Associates, a small consulting firm downtown. To anyone looking at my life from the outside, I appeared to be exactly what my parents always said I was. Ordinary, unremarkable, and quietly grateful for whatever small successes came my way. But appearances, as I was about to prove in the most spectacular fashion, can be devastatingly deceiving. It was exactly 1 week before my wedding to Michael, and I should have been floating on pure happiness. Instead, I sat in my childhood bedroom at my parents' house laptop, balanced on my knees, scrolling through what looked like routine office emails, while my stomach churned with a familiar mixture of excitement and dread. The excitement came from knowing that in 7 days I'd be walking down the aisle toward the most wonderful man I'd ever known. The dread well that came from being back in this house where I'd spent 28 years, being reminded that I would never quite measure up. My phone buzzed with an incoming call, and I glanced at the screen before quickly declining it. The caller ID showed a number I recognized immediately, but answering it would have required explanations I wasn't ready to give. Not yet, anyway. Instead, I tucked the phone between my pillows and returned to my laptop, where another message had just arrived in my supposedly routine work inbox. This one, like several others over the past few months, contained details about quarterly projections and expansion opportunities that would have seemed impossibly complex for a simple administrative coordinator to understand. I closed the laptop quickly as footsteps approached my door. Old habits die hard, and even at 28, I still found myself hiding things that might invite unwanted questions, or worse, unwanted comparisons to my younger sister Sophie. "Emily, dinner's ready," my mother called through the door, her voice carrying that particular tone of resigned duty she'd perfected over the years. It wasn't cruel exactly, but it wasn't warm either. It was the voice of someone going through necessary motions. "Coming, Mom," I replied, sliding the laptop under my bed and checking my reflection in the dresser mirror. The woman looking back at me appeared perfectly ordinary, shoulder-length dark hair, conservative clothing, the kind of face that blended into crowds. My parents had always made it clear that this ordinariness was both my defining characteristic and my greatest limitation. Downstairs, the dining room buzzed with the kind of energy that only appeared when Sophie was home. My sister at 25 had already established herself as one of the most promising young fashion designers in the city. Her latest collection had been featured in 3 major magazines, and she had a waiting list of clients that included local celebrities and socialites. Tonight she held court at the dinner table, regaling our parents with stories from her latest photo shoot while they hung on every word. The photographer said my designs had a sophistication that reminded him of early Valentino. Sophie was saying, her perfectly manicured hands gesturing expressively. He wants to feature the entire spring line in the magazine's anniversary issue. That's wonderful, sweetheart. Dad beamed, his face radiating the kind of pride I'd seen countless times but never quite directed at me with the same intensity. I always knew you were destined for greatness. I took my seat quietly, hoping to avoid drawing attention to myself, but Sophie's sharp eyes caught the movement. "Oh, Emily's here," she said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "How's the wedding planning going? Still having it at that little community center?" "It's not a community center," I replied evenly, though my cheeks warmed. "It's the Malibu estate. It's actually quite beautiful." "I'm sure it is," Sophie said in a tone that suggested the opposite. "Very practical. That's so you, isn't it? Always choosing the sensible option." Mom nodded approvingly at Sophie's observation. "Well, at least Emily found someone willing to marry her. Michael seems like a nice, stable man. Perfect for someone with Emily's limitations." The words stung as they were meant to, but I'd learned long ago not to show the hurt. Instead, I focused on my plate and tried to remember that in 7 days I would be Mrs. Michael Rodriguez, and I could finally stop caring what my family thought of my choices. The conversation drifted back to Sophie's career achievements, and I let my mind wander to the memory of my college graduation 4 years ago. I'd finished summa cum laude with a double major in business and economics, but the day had passed virtually unnoticed in our household. Sophie had gotten a small write-up in a local fashion blog that same week, and my parents had thrown an impromptu celebration dinner, inviting extended family and friends to toast her emerging talent. My graduation announcement had been relegated to a brief mention over breakfast, sandwiched between discussions of Sophie's latest design inspiration and weekend plans. After dinner, I retreated to my room and pulled out the small velvet box Michael had given me earlier that week. Inside was a delicate gold necklace with a small charm that looked like abstract letters intertwined. To anyone else, it would appear to be simply elegant jewelry. But I knew better. The charm wasn't abstract at all. It was the logo of a company that very few people knew I had any connection to whatsoever. Michael had presented it with a knowing smile and a gentle kiss on my forehead. He'd never said the words out loud, but that necklace was his way of telling me that he saw who I really was, even when I couldn't reveal it to anyone else. Even when my own family couldn't see past their preconceptions to notice that their ordinary daughter might be hiding something extraordinary. I was fastening the necklace around my neck, smiling at the thought of Michael's quiet confidence in me, when I heard voices drifting up from the living room below. My parents were still awake, probably having their evening coffee and discussing tomorrow's wedding preparations. I was about to put in my earbuds and return to checking my work emails when I caught my name in their conversation. Something in my mother's tone made me freeze. I set down my laptop and moved closer to the door, pressing my ear against the wood. "We'll humiliate her in front of 200 guests." The words hit me like ice water, and suddenly everything changed. In that moment, I realized that the wedding I'd been planning for months, the celebration I'd dreamed of since I was a little girl, was about to become the stage for something far more sinister than I'd ever imagined. My heart pounded so loudly, I was certain they could hear it downstairs. But I pressed my ear harder against the door, straining to catch every word of what was quickly becoming the most devastating conversation of my life. "The slideshow is perfect." My mother's voice carried a satisfaction I'd never heard directed toward anything involving me. "I found all those old photos from when she was going through that awkward phase in high school. Remember when she had that terrible haircut and those thick glasses? And that picture from her 16th birthday when she spilled cake all over herself. The guests will get quite a show." My father's chuckle was low and cruel. "The speech will set it up perfectly. I've been working on it all week. It starts sweet, talking about how proud we are, and then gradually reveals the truth about our daughter's many failures and disappointments. By the time I'm finished, those 200 guests will understand exactly why we never had much hope for Emily's future." I felt sick. Every humiliating moment from my childhood, every awkward phase, every small mistake I'd thought my parents had forgotten or forgiven was apparently being compiled into some sort of public execution disguised as a father's wedding toast. The photos they were discussing flashed through my memory with painful clarity. The haircut I'd begged for because I thought it would make me look sophisticated like Sophie. The glasses I'd worn before I could afford contact lenses. The birthday party where I'd been so nervous about giving a speech that I'd knocked over my own cake. But the real masterstroke, my mother continued with obvious glee, is Sophie's contribution. Tell her what you've arranged, sweetheart. Sophie's voice joined the conversation, and I could practically hear her smile through the floor. Oh, it's going to be absolutely perfect, Mom. I went to see Emily's precious wedding dress last week when she wasn't home. Told the seamstress I wanted to check the alterations as a surprise for my sister. What did you do? Dad asked, though his tone suggested he already knew he'd be pleased with the answer. I loosened the seams at strategic points, Sophie said, her voice dripping with malicious satisfaction. The dress will hold together just fine for the ceremony and the photos. But I also sewed in a nearly invisible string along the back seam. During the reception, when Emily's up there giving her thank you speech to all 200 guests, I'll be standing right behind her. One little pull and the entire dress will fall apart. The seams will give way and she'll be standing there in nothing but her underwear while everyone watches. The room spun around me. My beautiful wedding dress, the one I'd saved for months to afford, the one that made me feel like a princess when I tried it on, had been turned into an instrument of my own humiliation. I thought about all the important people who would be there. Michael's family, his business associates, our college friends, extended family members I hadn't seen in years. All 200 of them would witness what my family clearly saw as my ultimate comeuppance. The timing has to be perfect, my mother added. Right when she's in the middle of thanking everyone, feeling confident and happy, that's when she needs to be brought back down to earth. Don't worry, Sophie laughed. I've practiced the motion. I'll be positioned right behind her, pretending to adjust her train or fix her veil. No one will suspect a thing until it's too late. And by then, everyone will have seen exactly what kind of person Emily really is underneath all her pretenses. My phone buzzed against my pillow, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. Grabbing it quickly to silence it, I saw an encrypted message notification on my screen. My heart was still racing from the conversation below, but professional instinct made me open the message despite my emotional state. EC urgent update needed on the Morrison acquisition. Final contracts require your signature by Friday. Team is ready to close the deal but needs your approval on the adjusted terms. This could be the biggest win yet, 7 figures confirmed. I stared at the message, my mind struggling to shift gears from the horror of my family's betrayal to the complex business deal that required my immediate attention. Another message appeared almost instantly. Additionally, the Singapore expansion proposal has been approved by their board. They want to meet next week to finalize the partnership agreement. The potential revenue streams we discussed are all green-lighted. This is happening faster than we anticipated. A third message followed seconds later, this one marked with the highest encryption level my company used for only the most sensitive communications. Emily, the international partners are pushing for the announcement. They believe the timing is perfect with the market conditions. Are you ready to go public with the merger? The valuation numbers are beyond what we projected. We're looking at transforming the entire industry landscape. I quickly typed back a response, my fingers shaking slightly, as I tried to focus on business, while my family plotted my destruction just one floor below. Hold all major announcements until after this weekend. Maintain current discretion protocols. We'll review all contracts and proposals Monday. Proceed with standard due diligence, but no signatures without my direct approval. Just as I hit send, Sophie's voice drifted up from below again, and I realized I'd missed part of their conversation while dealing with the business messages. Marcus said he'd make sure the photographer captures everything, she was saying. He owes Mom a favor from way back, and he's looking forward to helping us teach Emily a lesson about knowing her place. Marcus. I didn't recognize the name, but the way she said Mom's old acquaintance with such familiarity suggested this went deeper than I'd realized. My mother had apparently recruited someone from outside the family to help orchestrate my humiliation. Someone with professional photography skills who could ensure the most embarrassing moment of my life was perfectly documented. It's about time Emily learned that just because she managed to trick some man into marrying her doesn't mean she's suddenly special, my father added. She's always been the weak link in this family, and it's time everyone saw that. The best part, Sophie continued, is that she'll have no idea what's coming. She'll be standing up there probably feeling proud and confident for once in her pathetic life, and then reality will come crashing down. Literally. My phone buzzed again with another encrypted message, but I couldn't bring myself to look at it. The contrast between my secret professional life and my family's perception of me had never felt more surreal. Here I was receiving urgent communications about million-dollar deals and international business partnerships, while my own family plotted to strip away my dignity in the most literal sense possible. The dress will collapse at the perfect moment. Sophie's voice grew cold and calculating as she continued. Right when everyone's watching her speech, right when she thinks she's the center of attention for all the right reasons, she'll become the laughingstock she's always been meant to be. I heard chairs scraping against the floor as they began to move around downstairs, and I quickly backed away from my door. My entire body was trembling not just from fear, but from a rage so pure and focused that it surprised me with its intensity. My own family wasn't just planning to embarrass me at my wedding. They were planning to destroy me, to strip away every shred of dignity I had in front of everyone who mattered to me. But as I sat there in the darkness of my childhood bedroom, surrounded by the remnants of a girl who had always been told she wasn't enough, something shifted inside me. Sophie's final words echoed in my mind, but instead of despair, I felt a cold, calculating fury that matched my sister's own tone. Sophie sneered coldly. Her dress will collapse at the perfect moment, right when everyone's watching her speech. Something extraordinary happened in the silence that followed Sophie's cruel declaration. Instead of the tears I might have expected, instead of the panic that would have consumed the old Emily, I felt a peculiar sense of calm settle over me like a familiar coat. I sat back on my heels away from the door and found myself smiling in the darkness of my childhood room. It was the same smile I wore during high-stakes business negotiations, the one that appeared when an opponent showed their hand too early and revealed exactly how I could defeat them. My family had just made the critical error that every successful entrepreneur learns to watch for. They had underestimated their competition. The voices downstairs continued their planning, but I no longer needed to listen. I had heard enough to understand the full scope of their scheme, and more importantly, I now understood exactly what kind of people I was dealing with. This wasn't just sibling rivalry or parental disappointment. This was a calculated attempt to destroy me at the most important moment of my life, and they expected me to stand there helplessly while it happened. They had no idea who they were actually fighting. I moved away from the door and settled cross-legged on my bed, pulling my laptop back out from underneath it. My fingers moved across the keyboard with practiced efficiency, accessing a contact list that existed in a completely separate world from my life in this house. As I scrolled through names, I thought about how many years I had spent in this very room, believing that my family's assessment of my worth was accurate. How many nights I had lain here wondering why I couldn't be more like Sophie, why I couldn't make my parents proud, why I always seemed to fall short of their expectations. The memory that surfaced was from 3 years ago during one of the last family dinners I had attended before Michael and I got engaged. I had been excited, bursting with news that I couldn't wait to share. My business had just landed its first major contract, a deal that had taken months of careful negotiation and had finally validated everything I had been working toward. I have some exciting news, I had announced during a lull in Sophie's latest career updates. My consulting business just secured a partnership with Hartwell Industries. It's a 6-figure contract, and they want to expand our relationship next year. The silence that followed was deafening. My father had looked at me with the kind of pitying expression usually reserved for children who claimed they could fly. My mother had actually laughed, a sound that still echoed painfully in my memory. "Oh, Emily," she had said, shaking her head. "You and your little fantasies. A 6-figure contract, really? Don't you think it's time to focus on realistic goals? Sophie had been the one to deliver the final blow. It's sweet that you're trying so hard to compete with me, but maybe you should stick to what you're actually good at. Filing and answering phones, right? They had all laughed then, and I had felt myself shrinking back into the familiar role of the family disappointment. But tonight, as I remembered that moment, I felt something entirely different. They hadn't been laughing at my failure. They had been laughing at a success they were too blind to recognize, and that changed everything. I found the contact I was looking for and checked the time. It was nearly 10 p.m., but Isabella Marchetti kept notoriously late hours, especially during busy season. Isabella was more than just a designer. She was an artist who had transformed corporate events for some of the biggest companies on the West Coast. More importantly, she was someone who understood exactly what I was capable of because she had worked with me directly on 3 major company galas over the past 2 years. The phone rang twice before her familiar voice answered warm, despite the late hour. "Emily, I was wondering when you'd call. Please tell me you're not canceling the consultation for your dress alterations. I've been looking forward to working on a wedding project." "Isabella, I need your help with something much more important than alterations," I said, and something in my tone must have alerted her to the seriousness of the situation because her voice immediately shifted to match my intensity. "What's wrong?" I gave her the condensed version, explaining about the sabotage, the loosened seams, and the hidden string that was designed to humiliate me in front of 200 guests. As I spoke, I could hear her intake of breath and the sound of her moving around what I knew was her design studio. "Those absolute monsters," she breathed when I finished. "Emily, I am so sorry. But also I have to say they have no idea who they're messing with. Do they?" "No, they don't." I agreed, and for the first time all evening, I felt genuinely happy. "Can you help me turn this around?" "Darling, can I help you turn this around?" Isabella's laugh was pure mischief. "I've been designing transformation reveals for Fortune 500 companies for 15 years. What your sister thinks she's arranged is child's play compared to what we're going to create. By the time I'm finished, that string she's planning to pull will trigger the most spectacular dress reveal anyone has ever seen." We spent the next 20 minutes discussing logistics timing and the specific modifications we would need to make. Isabella's excitement was infectious, and I found myself genuinely looking forward to my wedding day for the first time since overhearing my family's conversation. "The key," she explained, "is that everything has to look completely normal until the moment of truth. Your sister will pull that string expecting your dress to fall apart, but instead she'll trigger a carefully designed transformation that will leave every single guest speechless." "How quickly can we make this happen?" I asked. "I'll pick up your dress first thing tomorrow morning and have it back to you by Friday. Emily, trust me when I say that by the time we're finished, your sister won't just fail to humiliate you. She's going to accidentally give you the most spectacular wedding moment anyone has ever seen." As I hung up the phone, I realized that my hands were completely steady. The panic, the fear, even the anger had transformed into something much more powerful, absolute certainty. I thought about all the years I had spent letting my family's opinions dictate how I felt about myself, all the times I had apologized for taking up space or asking for recognition. Those days were over. I thought about the business empire I had been building in secret, about the respect I commanded in boardrooms across the city, about the million-dollar deals that crossed my desk every week. I thought about Michael, who saw my worth even when I struggled to see it myself. And I thought about the 200 guests who would be attending my wedding, most of whom had no idea that the bride they'd be watching was someone very different from the person my family had always claimed I was. Sophie thought she was going to expose me as a fraud in front of everyone who mattered. What she was actually going to do was provide me with the perfect opportunity to reveal exactly who I had become. After making the call, Emily just smiled and whispered, "Let's see who becomes the Laughingstock." The satisfaction of my whispered declaration was still warming me when I heard a soft knock on my bedroom door. Not the sharp, impatient rap my parents used, or Sophie's entitled pounding, but the gentle tap that could only belong to one person in this house. "Come in, Grandma Rose," I called quietly, closing my laptop and setting it aside as the door opened to reveal the one family member who had never made me feel like I needed to apologize for existing. At 78, my grandmother moved with the careful dignity of someone who had weathered decades of family storms and emerged stronger for it. Her silver hair was pulled back in its characteristic neat bun, and even in her nightrobe and slippers, she carried herself with an elegance that my mother had always envied but never managed to emulate. "I thought I heard your voice on the phone," she said, settling herself on the edge of my bed with the familiarity of someone who had been offering comfort in this room for 28 years. "And before that I heard voices downstairs that made my blood boil." I looked at her sharply. "You heard them?" "These old walls aren't as thick as your parents think they are," Grandma Rose said grimly. "I heard enough to understand what they're planning for your wedding day, and I want you to know that I am absolutely disgusted by their behavior." The relief that washed over me was so intense it nearly brought tears to my eyes. For a moment, I had feared that even my grandmother might side with the rest of the family, that I truly was alone in this house full of people who were supposed to love me. "I don't understand why they hate me so much," I whispered, voicing the fear that had haunted me since childhood. Grandma Rose reached over and took my hands in hers, her grip warm and surprisingly strong. "Oh, sweetheart, they don't hate you. That's what makes this so much worse. They're afraid of you, and they always have been." "Afraid of me?" I couldn't hide my disbelief. "Grandma, I'm the family disappointment. I'm the one who never measures up to Sophie, who works a boring office job while she designs for celebrities. What could they possibly fear?" My grandmother's laugh was soft, but held an edge of something that might have been pride. "Emily, dear, you've built an entire empire right under their noses, and I've been watching you do it. All those late nights when you thought everyone was asleep, all those phone calls you take in the garden because you think no one notices. I've seen you working at that kitchen table at 2 a.m. with spreadsheets and contracts spread out like you're running a war room." My heart stopped. "You know, I've known for over a year that you're far more than you let this family believe," she said gently. "I may be old, but I'm not blind. I've watched you transform from a girl who let her parents diminish her into a woman who commands respect from people they could never even dream of impressing." The validation I felt in that moment was overwhelming. Someone had been seeing me, truly seeing me, even when I thought I was completely invisible. "But why didn't you ever say anything?" I asked. "Because you weren't ready," Grandma Rose replied simply. "You needed to find your own strength first, and you needed to decide for yourself when you were ready to stop hiding who you've become. Tonight, listening to their vicious plans, I realized that moment has arrived." She paused, studying my face with the keen intelligence that had always made her the wisest person I knew. "Tell me what you're planning to do about this situation." I found myself sharing everything with her. Isabella's plan, the dress transformation, my certainty that I could turn their sabotage into my triumph. As I spoke, I watched my grandmother's expression shift from concern to approval to something that looked distinctly like anticipation. "Your truth and talent will triumph," she said when I finished, and the certainty in her voice made my spine straighten with new confidence. "They've underestimated you for the last time, and they're about to learn exactly what that mistake costs." "Will you help me?" I asked, though I already knew the answer from the fire in her eyes. "Emily, I would be honored to help you," she said firmly. "More than that, I want you to give me copies of everything. The recordings, any evidence you gather, all of it. I'll store it safely, and if they try to claim later that any of this was your imagination or your vindictiveness, they'll have to explain it to me first." The idea of my formidable grandmother confronting my parents with evidence of their conspiracy was almost as satisfying as imagining their faces when their sabotage backfired. "There's something else you should know." Grandma Rose continued, her voice dropping to a more serious tone. "This isn't the first time your mother has tried to destroy someone she felt threatened by. When she was younger, before she married your father, she betrayed someone very close to this family, someone who trusted her completely." "What do you mean?" I asked, though something in her tone made me suspect I wasn't going to like the answer. "Your mother had an affair with her sister's husband," Grandma Rose said quietly. "She broke up a marriage and destroyed her own sister's life, all because she couldn't stand that someone else was happier and more successful than she was. The family never recovered from that betrayal. We lost people we loved because of your mother's jealousy and selfishness." The revelation hit me like a physical blow. My mother, who had spent my entire life lecturing me about moral character and proper behavior, had destroyed her own sister's marriage out of pure spite. "Why are you telling me this?" I whispered. "Because you need to understand that what they're planning to do to you isn't just cruel, it's part of a pattern," Grandma Rose said, her voice steady but her eyes sad. "Your mother has spent her whole life tearing down anyone who threatens her sense of superiority. She did it to her own sister, and now she's doing it to her own daughter. But Emily, there are deeper secrets in this family, things that go back years, and if they push you too far, those secrets will come to light." I stared at her, trying to process the implications of what she was telling me. "What other secrets?" "Let's hope we don't have to find out," she said cryptically. "But if they want to play these kinds of games with you, they should remember that they're not the only ones with ammunition." My grandmother stood up, then smoothing down her nightrobe with the same dignity she brought to everything she did. She bent down and kissed my forehead, a gesture that reminded me of every night she had tucked me in as a child, every time she had made me feel safe and loved in a house where those feelings were rare. "Get some sleep, sweetheart," she said. "You're going to need your strength for what's coming. But remember, you're not fighting this battle alone anymore." As she moved toward the door, she paused and turned back to me. In the dim light from my bedside lamp, her face looked suddenly younger, as if the prospect of the coming confrontation had awakened something fierce and protective that had been sleeping for years. Grandmother whispers, "They fear you because they know you're more powerful than them, but they don't know how powerful." The satisfaction of my whispered declaration was still warming me when I heard a soft knock on my bedroom door. Not the sharp, impatient rap my parents used, or Sophie's entitled pounding, but the gentle tap that could only belong to one person in this house. "Come in." Grandma Rose. I called quietly, closing my laptop and setting it aside as the door opened to reveal the one family member who had never made me feel like I needed to apologize for existing. At 78, my grandmother moved with the careful dignity of someone who had weathered decades of family storms and emerged stronger for it. Her silver hair was pulled back in its characteristic neat bun, and even in her nightrobe and slippers, she carried herself with an elegance that my mother had always envied but never managed to emulate. "I thought I heard your voice on the phone," she said, settling herself on the edge of my bed, with the familiarity of someone who had been offering comfort in this room for 28 years. "And before that, I heard voices downstairs that made my blood boil." I looked at her sharply. "You heard them." "These old walls aren't as thick as your parents think they are," Grandma Rose said grimly. "I heard enough to understand what they're planning for your wedding day, and I want you to know that I am absolutely disgusted by their behavior." The relief that washed over me was so intense it nearly brought tears to my eyes. For a moment, I had feared that even my grandmother might side with the rest of the family, that I truly was alone in this house full of people who were supposed to love me. "I don't understand why they hate me so much," I whispered, voicing the fear that had haunted me since childhood. Grandma Rose reached over and took my hands in hers, her grip warm and surprisingly strong. "Oh, sweetheart, they don't hate you. That's what makes this so much worse. They're afraid of you, and they always have been." "Afraid of me?" I couldn't hide my disbelief. "Grandma, I'm the family disappointment. I'm the one who never measures up to Sophie, who works a boring office job while she designs for celebrities. What could they possibly fear?" My grandmother's laugh was soft, but held an edge of something that might have been pride. Emily, dear, you've built an entire empire right under their noses, and I've been watching you do it. All those late nights when you thought everyone was asleep, all those phone calls you take in the garden because you think no one notices. I've seen you working at that kitchen table at 2 a.m. with spreadsheets and contracts spread out like you're running a war room. My heart stopped. You know, I've known for over a year that you're far more than you let this family believe, she said gently. I may be old, but I'm not blind. I've watched you transform from a girl who let her parents diminish her into a woman who commands respect from people they could never even dream of impressing. The validation I felt in that moment was overwhelming. Someone had been seeing me, truly seeing me, even when I thought I was completely invisible. But why didn't you ever say anything? I asked. Because you weren't ready, Grandma Rose replied simply. You needed to find your own strength first, and you needed to decide for yourself when you were ready to stop hiding who you've become. Tonight, listening to their vicious plans, I realized that moment has arrived. She paused, studying my face with the keen intelligence that had always made her the wisest person I knew. Tell me what you're planning to do about this situation. I found myself sharing everything with her. Isabella's plan, the dress transformation, my certainty that I could turn their sabotage into my triumph. As I spoke, I watched my grandmother's expression shift from concern to approval to something that looked distinctly like anticipation. Your truth and talent will triumph, she said when I finished, and the certainty in her voice made my spine straighten with new confidence. They've underestimated you for the last time, and they're about to learn exactly what that mistake costs. Will you help me? I asked, though I already knew the answer from the fire in her eyes. Emily, I would be honored to help you, she said firmly. More than that, I want you to give me copies of everything. The recordings, any evidence you gather, all of it. I'll store it safely, and if they try to claim later that any of this was your imagination or your vindictiveness, they'll have to explain it to me first. The idea of my formidable grandmother confronting my parents with evidence of their conspiracy was almost as satisfying as imagining their faces when their sabotage backfired. There's something else you should know. Grandma Rose continued, her voice dropping to a more serious tone. This isn't the first time your mother has tried to destroy someone she felt threatened by. When she was younger, before she married your father, she betrayed someone very close to this family, someone who trusted her completely. What do you mean? I asked, though something in her tone made me suspect I wasn't going to like the answer. Your mother had an affair with her sister's husband, Grandma Rose said quietly. She broke up a marriage and destroyed her own sister's life, all because she couldn't stand that someone else was happier and more successful than she was. The family never recovered from that betrayal. We lost people we loved because of your mother's jealousy and selfishness. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. My mother, who had spent my entire life lecturing me about moral character and proper behavior, had destroyed her own sister's marriage out of pure spite. Why are you telling me this? I whispered. Because you need to understand that what they're planning to do to you isn't just cruel, it's part of a pattern, Grandma Rose said, her voice steady, but her eyes sad. Your mother has spent her whole life tearing down anyone who threatens her sense of superiority. She did it to her own sister, and now she's doing it to her own daughter. But Emily, there are deeper secrets in this family, things that go back years, and if they push you too far, those secrets will come to light. I stared at her, trying to process the implications of what she was telling me. What other secrets? Let's hope we don't have to find out, she said cryptically. But if they want to play these kinds of games with you, they should remember that they're not the only ones with ammunition. My grandmother stood up, then smoothing down her nightrobe with the same dignity she brought to everything she did. She bent down and kissed my forehead, a gesture that reminded me of every night she had tucked me in as a child, every time she had made me feel safe and loved in a house where those feelings were rare. Get some sleep, sweetheart, she said. You're going to need your strength for what's coming. But remember, you're not fighting this battle alone anymore. As she moved toward the door, she paused and turned back to me. In the dim light from my bedside lamp, her face looked suddenly younger, as if the prospect of the coming confrontation had awakened something fierce and protective that had been sleeping for years. Grandmother whispers, "They fear you because they know you're more powerful than them, but they don't know how powerful." The weight of Marcus Thornfield's threat hung in the air long after his recorded voice had fallen silent. But instead of feeling overwhelmed, I found myself shifting into the analytical mindset that had made me successful in the boardroom. This was no longer just a family betrayal. It was a complex, multi-pronged attack that required the same strategic thinking I used to navigate hostile corporate takeovers. I pulled out a legal pad and began mapping the conspiracy with the methodical precision I applied to business risk assessments. At the top of the page, I wrote, "Wedding Day Sabotage," and drew lines connecting each element of their plan. The humiliating father's speech designed to expose my supposed failures to 200 guests. The slideshow of embarrassing childhood photos timed to maximize my shame. Sophie's dress sabotage with the hidden string, calculated to strip away my dignity at the moment when I should feel most confident. And now the revelation of fake witnesses people Marcus had apparently recruited to provide testimony about my character flaws. Each threat was designed to build upon the others, creating a crescendo of humiliation that would leave me emotionally destroyed and socially ruined. It was actually quite sophisticated in its cruelty, and I felt a grudging respect for the planning involved, even as I despised the people behind it. But as I studied the attack vectors, I began to see something my family had missed in their eagerness to tear me down. They had overextended themselves. Too many moving parts, too many people involved, too many opportunities for their plan to backfire spectacularly. In business, I had learned that the most elaborate schemes were often the most vulnerable to counterattacks, and this conspiracy was about to become a textbook example of that principle. More importantly, as I analyzed their motives, a pattern emerged that explained everything. This wasn't really about Sophie's jealousy or my parents' disappointment in my perceived failures. This was about control, and specifically about their growing suspicion that I was no longer the controllable daughter they thought they knew. I thought back over the past year, remembering small moments that suddenly took on new significance. My mother's questions about my new confidence and where it was coming from. My father's probing inquiries about my finances when I had casually mentioned being able to afford the Malibu estate venue. Sophie's increasingly desperate attempts to provoke me into emotional reactions that never came anymore. They had sensed the change in me before I had even fully acknowledged it myself. Somewhere along the way, I had stopped seeking their approval and started building something they couldn't understand or control. My business success had given me an independence they couldn't manipulate, and that terrified them. The wedding was supposed to be their opportunity to reassert dominance, to remind me and everyone else that I was still the weak, dependent daughter who needed their guidance to survive. But they had made a critical miscalculation. They assumed that because I had hidden my success from them, I was still the same insecure girl who could be broken by their disapproval. What they didn't realize was that I had been protecting them from the truth of what I had become, not hiding from it myself. My phone chimed with an email notification, and I glanced at the screen expecting another encrypted business message. Instead, I found something that made my pulse quicken with a mixture of hope and apprehension. The sender was listed as a friend, and the subject line read simply, "You're not alone in this." I opened the message with trembling fingers, unsure whether I was about to discover another threat or the ally I desperately needed. "Emily, I know what Marcus is planning and I know why he's targeting you. I worked for your company until 6 months ago, and I've been watching this situation develop with growing concern. Marcus approached me 3 weeks ago trying to get information about your business operations and financial status. When I refused to help him, he made it clear that he intended to destroy both your personal life and your professional reputation." My heart pounded as I read on, recognizing the careful professional writing style of someone who understood corporate communication protocols. "I have documentation of his attempts to gather intelligence on your company, including emails where he explicitly states his intention to bring Emily Chen down as revenge for his termination. He's been working with your family for months, feeding them information and strategies for maximum damage. The wedding sabotage is just the beginning. He has plans to leak false information about your business practices to your clients and partners immediately afterward. I felt cold dread wash over me as the full scope of Marcus's revenge became clear. This wasn't just about humiliating me at my wedding. He intended to systematically destroy everything I had built using my own family as willing accomplices in the demolition of my professional life. I have evidence that can stop him, but we need to meet in person to coordinate our response. Marcus has already begun preliminary attacks on your company's reputation with key industry contacts. Time is running out and we need to act before he can do irreversible damage to relationships that took years to build. The message continued with technical details about Marcus's methods and timeline, revealing a sophistication that went far beyond family drama. He had been conducting corporate espionage, attempting to access confidential client information and laying groundwork for a systematic campaign of professional destruction that would coincide with my personal humiliation. As I reached the end of the email, I realized that this mysterious ally was offering me something invaluable: advance intelligence on an enemy who thought he was operating in complete secrecy. With the right counter-strategy, I could turn Marcus's own methods against him and protect everything I had worked to build. But the final lines of the message sent a chill down my spine as I understood just how high the stakes had become. The email ends, "Meet me before the wedding, or he will destroy both your marriage and your business." The urgent tone of the mysterious ally's email crystallized something that had been building in my mind since Isabella and I first discussed the dress transformation. This situation had evolved beyond a simple family confrontation into something that required the kind of coordinated response I would deploy for a major business crisis. If Marcus intended to wage war against both my personal life and my professional reputation, then I needed to assemble a team that could match his sophistication with superior strategy and execution. I scrolled through my phone contacts looking for the names that represented not just professional relationships, but people who had worked with me closely enough to understand both my capabilities and my character. The business network I had carefully cultivated over the past 5 years was about to become my secret weapon in a battle my family never saw coming. My first call went to Alexander Chen, no relation, despite the shared surname, whose event design company had transformed 3 of my most important corporate galas from simple business dinners into experiences that clients still talked about months later. Alexander was known throughout the industry for creating what he called impossible transformations, moments where reality shifted so dramatically that guests questioned what they had actually witnessed. "Emily," his voice carried the warmth of genuine friendship when he answered on the second ring. "Please tell me you're calling about something more exciting than quarterly budget reviews." "Alexander, I need your help with something that's going to sound completely insane, but I promise you it's the most important project either of us will ever work on," I said, and then launched into the full story of the sabotage plot, Marcus's involvement, and the counter-strategy Isabella and I had begun developing. The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped, but then Alexander's voice returned with an intensity I had never heard from him before. "Emily, what your family is planning isn't just cruel, it's criminal. Corporate sabotage, conspiracy to commit fraud, intentional infliction of emotional distress. We're talking about serious legal violations here," he said, and I could hear him moving around his studio as he spoke. "But more importantly, they've picked a fight with someone who has resources they can't even imagine. I'm not just going to help you, I'm going to make sure this becomes a masterclass in why you should never underestimate people you think you can control." Within minutes, Alexander had connected me with David Kim, a DJ, who had worked our company's annual celebration last year, and whose technical skills went far beyond music mixing. David specialized in multimedia presentations that synchronized audio-video and lighting effects with precision timing that could make even the most mundane corporate announcement feel like a theatrical production. "I remember your company event," David said when Alexander patched me through on a 3-way call. "That was the night you gave the closing speech about innovation and disruption, right?" You talked about how the most powerful victories come from letting your opponents underestimate you until the moment you reveal your true capabilities. I felt a chill of recognition as he quoted my own words back to me. You remember that speech. Emily, that speech changed how I think about my entire career, David replied. When Alexander told me what your family is planning, my first thought was that they obviously weren't paying attention that night. Anyone who heard you speak would know better than to try something like this. David explained how he could not only replace their malicious slideshow with evidence of their conspiracy, but coordinate the reveal with lighting and sound effects that would ensure maximum impact. More importantly, he could time the presentation to coincide perfectly with the dress transformation, creating a synchronized moment of revelation that would leave the entire reception speechless. My next call was to Janet Morrison, a cybersecurity specialist, who had left my company 6 months earlier to start her own consulting firm. Janet had always been someone who understood that information was power, and her departure had been entirely amicable. She'd actually thanked me for teaching her the business skills she needed to succeed as an entrepreneur. Janet, I have a situation that requires your particular expertise. I began, and then outlined Marcus's involvement and the need for comprehensive documentation of everything that was about to unfold. Marcus Thornfield, she said grimly when I finished. I remember him. He tried to access restricted client files during his last month with the company, claiming he needed them for transition purposes. I flagged it as suspicious, but by the time we investigated, he was already gone. Janet explained that she could discreetly access the venue's security camera system and ensure that every moment of the evening was recorded from multiple angles. More importantly, she could set up monitoring that would capture any attempts by Marcus or my family to interfere with our counter strategies in real time. Emily, what you're describing isn't just wedding day drama, she said. This is corporate warfare. And Marcus has been planning this for months. But he made one critical mistake. He assumed you were still the person he remembered from when he worked for you. He has no idea what you've become since then. As we coordinated the technical aspects of our response, I felt the familiar surge of confidence that came from working with competent professionals who understood both the stakes and the strategy. This was the world where I belonged, where my judgment was trusted and my leadership was respected. My family's conspiracy had accidentally reminded me of my own power by forcing me to deploy it. The calls continued for another hour as we refined every detail of our coordinated response. Alexander would work with Isabella to ensure the dress transformation was not just visually stunning but perfectly timed with David's multimedia presentation. Janet would provide real-time intelligence and documentation that would protect us from any legal challenges Marcus might attempt after his plans failed. By the time I hung up from the final coordination call, I felt like the CEO I had trained myself to become, rather than the victim my family expected me to remain. They thought they were orchestrating my destruction, but what they were actually doing was providing me with the perfect opportunity to demonstrate exactly who I had become when they weren't paying attention. My phone rang just as I was reviewing my notes from the evening's calls, and Isabella's name appeared on the screen. I answered immediately, knowing that her late-night work sessions often produced her most brilliant innovations. The designer calls back, "I've created something that will turn their sabotage into your triumph, but we need to execute it perfectly." Isabella's voice carried an excitement I had rarely heard from her, even during our most ambitious corporate event planning sessions. "Emily, I've been working on this design since we spoke, and I need you to understand that what we're creating isn't just a dress transformation. It's going to be the most spectacular reveal anyone at that wedding has ever witnessed." I could hear papers rustling in the background as she spoke, and I knew she was surrounded by sketches and fabric samples in the creative chaos that marked her most inspired work sessions. The anticipation in her voice was infectious, and I found myself leaning forward as if I could somehow see the designs she was describing through the phone. "Tell me everything," I said, settling back against my pillows and pulling a notebook toward me to capture the details of what was clearly going to be an intricate operation. I drove to the bridal shop this afternoon and examined your dress using the key you gave me, Isabella began. Sophie's sabotage is actually quite sophisticated for an amateur. She didn't just loosen random seams, she identified the structural points that would create maximum damage with minimum effort. The hidden string she installed runs along the back seam and connects to 3 critical attachment points. When pulled, it would normally cause the entire bodice to separate from the skirt while simultaneously loosening the side seams. I felt a fresh wave of anger at the calculated nature of Sophie's cruelty, but Isabella's next words transformed that emotion into something closer to anticipation. But here's where her plan becomes our opportunity, Isabella continued with obvious satisfaction. Instead of fighting against her sabotage system, we're going to weaponize it. I'm redesigning your dress as a 2-layer transformation piece. The outer layer will look exactly like your original gown, but it will be constructed as a carefully engineered breakaway system that uses Sophie's string as the trigger mechanism. As she explained the technical details, I began to understand the brilliance of her approach. Rather than trying to prevent Sophie's sabotage, we were going to turn it into the centerpiece of an unforgettable reveal that would leave every guest talking about the wedding for years to come. The outer dress is going to be constructed from lightweight silk panels that are designed to fall away in a cascading pattern when the string is pulled, Isabella explained. But instead of falling like torn fabric, the panels will separate along predetermined lines and flutter down like enormous flower petals. I'm adding weighted silk inserts that will create a graceful floating effect under the ballroom lighting. The image she was painting was breathtaking, but I knew the real magic would be in what was revealed underneath. What about the inner gown? Emily, the inner gown is going to transform you into something that looks like it stepped out of a fairy tale. Isabella's voice dropped to an almost reverent whisper. I'm using a crystal-studded fabric that will catch every light in the ballroom and throw it back in prismatic sparkles. The silhouette is more dramatic than your original dress, a fitted bodice that emphasizes your figure and a flowing skirt that will seem to glow under the lights. She explained how she was incorporating strategic placement of Swarovski crystals that would create patterns of light across the fabric, turning Emily into what she called a living constellation when the transformation was complete. The inner gown would be everything the outer dress was not: bold, glamorous, and impossible to ignore. But the visual impact is only part of the strategy, Isabella continued. I'm also installing tearaway panels at specific points on the outer dress that will create dramatic flourishes when they separate. Think of it as controlled demolition. Every piece will fall exactly where we want it to, creating maximum theatrical effect, while ensuring you remain completely covered and dignified throughout the transformation. As she detailed the engineering behind the spectacle, I realized we were creating something that went beyond simple sabotage reversal. We were staging what amounted to a live performance art piece that would turn Sophie's moment of expected triumph into Emily's coronation as the undisputed star of her own wedding. There's one more element to the plan, Isabella said, and I detected a note of mischief in her voice that made me smile in anticipation. You mentioned that Sophie will be wearing a white dress to try to upstage you. Yes, she's planning to draw attention away from me throughout the reception, I confirmed. Well, I had a conversation with the seamstress who altered Sophie's dress last week, Isabella said with obvious satisfaction. It turns out she's a client of mine from the Morrison Industries gala we did last year. She was horrified when I explained what Sophie was planning to do to you, and she was more than happy to make a few adjustments to Sophie's gown. I felt a thrill of anticipation as Isabella explained how they had subtly loosened several key stitches in Sophie's dress, particularly around the areas where she would need to move most dramatically to reach behind me and pull the string. The alterations were virtually invisible, but would create structural weak points that would give way under stress. The beauty of it is that Sophie will actually cause her own wardrobe malfunction, Isabella explained. When she lunges forward to pull your string, the motion will put stress on the compromised seams of her own dress. While you're transforming into a goddess, she'll be dealing with a very real and very embarrassing dress failure of her own. The poetic justice of the situation was almost too perfect to believe. Sophie's own sabotage motion would not only trigger my transformation, but simultaneously destroy her own attempt to look glamorous at my expense. "How long will you need to complete the modifications?" I asked, already mentally adjusting my timeline for the remaining wedding preparations. "I'll have everything ready by Friday afternoon," Isabella promised. "But Emily, I need you to understand that the success of this plan depends on precise timing and positioning. Sophie has to pull that string at exactly the right moment, and you need to be standing in the perfect position under the ballroom lights for maximum impact." I could hear the weight of responsibility in her voice as she outlined the critical factors that would determine whether our counter-sabotage became a triumph or a disaster. This wasn't just about creating a beautiful dress, we were orchestrating a moment of pure theater that required flawless execution. The designer whispers, "When she pulls that string, you'll transform from bride to goddess, but timing is everything." Isabella's emphasis on perfect timing reminded me that our dress transformation, no matter how spectacular, was only one element of a much larger battle. As I ended the call and sat in the quiet darkness of my childhood bedroom, I realized that while we had addressed the physical sabotage, I still needed to prepare for the character assassination that Marcus and my family were planning to unleash alongside it. I pulled my laptop back onto my bed and accessed the secure folder where I had been storing all the intelligence I had gathered about their conspiracy. Hidden among the recordings and financial documents was a detail I had initially overlooked, but now struck me as critically important. In one of the overheard conversations, my father had mentioned inviting someone who knew Emily in college and could provide perspective on her real character. The phrasing had seemed odd at the time, but now I understood exactly what it meant. They weren't just planning to humiliate me with a slideshow and a wardrobe malfunction, they were preparing to destroy my reputation with testimonial evidence from people who supposedly knew me well enough to speak authoritatively about my character flaws. I spent the next hour cross-referencing the wedding guest list against my memories of college relationships, and the pattern that emerged made my stomach turn with disgust. 3 names stood out as people I had dated briefly during my freshman and sophomore years' relationships that had ended amicably but could potentially be twisted into damaging narratives by someone with malicious intent. The most likely candidate was Derek Mitchell, who I had dated for 6 months during my sophomore year before we mutually agreed we were better as friends. Derek had always been somewhat bitter about academic competition, and I remembered him making cutting comments about my business aspirations when I started developing my first entrepreneurial ideas. If Marcus had approached him with the right combination of manipulation and financial incentive, Derek could be coached to present a version of our relationship that painted me as dishonest, manipulative, or professionally incompetent. But as I stared at Derek's name on the guest list, I realized that Marcus had made the same critical error that my family kept making. He was still thinking of me as the uncertain college student who had briefly dated Derek Mitchell, not as the CEO who now commanded resources and relationships that could neutralize any character attack he might attempt. I opened my phone and scrolled to a contact that represented one of the most important professional relationships I had cultivated over the past 3 years. Victoria Hartwell was the CEO of Hartwell Industries, the Fortune 500 company that had given my business its first major breakthrough contract. More importantly, Victoria had become something close to a mentor, someone who understood both the challenges of building a company from scratch and the specific difficulties faced by young women in leadership roles. When Victoria answered on the second ring, despite the late hour, I felt a familiar surge of gratitude for the professional relationships that had become the foundation of my new life. "Emily, I was just thinking about you." Victoria's voice carried the warmth of genuine friendship alongside her characteristic executive efficiency. "Robert Chen mentioned that you're getting married this weekend. Congratulations, though I have to say I'm surprised you didn't invite your favorite client to the celebration." The opening was perfect, and I seized it immediately. "Victoria, that's actually why I'm calling. I know this is incredibly short notice, but would you and Robert consider being my guests at the wedding? There's a situation developing that requires the presence of people who can speak knowledgeably about my professional capabilities and personal character." I gave her the condensed version of the conspiracy, focusing on the business elements that I knew would resonate with her experience of corporate warfare. Victoria listened without interruption, and when I finished, the silence on the other end of the line lasted long enough that I wondered if I had shocked her into speechlessness. "Emily," she finally said, and her voice carried a cold fury that reminded me why she was one of the most feared negotiators in her industry. "What you're describing isn't just family drama. This is a coordinated attack on a business leader by people who should be protecting her instead of trying to destroy her. Robert and I will absolutely be there, and I can guarantee that if anyone attempts to question your character or capabilities in our presence, they will deeply regret the decision." Within minutes, Victoria had connected me with Robert Chen, the venture capitalist who had led the investment round that transformed my company from a promising startup into a major player in our industry. Robert's reaction was even more direct than Victoria's. "Emily, I've seen you negotiate with some of the toughest executives in the business world," he said after I explained the situation. "Anyone who thinks they can intimidate or manipulate you clearly has no idea who they're dealing with. We'll be honored to attend your wedding and remind everyone present exactly what kind of leader you've become." With Victoria and Robert confirmed as head table guests, I turned my attention to assembling the evidence portfolio that would serve as my nuclear option if the character attacks escalated beyond what my witnesses could handle through their mere presence. I spent the next 2 hours compiling a comprehensive documentation of my professional achievements, signed contracts worth millions of dollars, industry awards, recognizing my innovation and leadership testimonials from clients praising both my business acumen and personal integrity. The portfolio told a story that was completely inconsistent with anything Derek Mitchell or any other recruited witness could possibly claim about my character. More importantly, it established a professional identity so impressive that any attempts to diminish me would immediately reveal the attackers as either misinformed or deliberately malicious. As I worked, I found myself thinking about the broader implications of what I was preparing. This wasn't just about defending myself against false accusations. It was about finally revealing to my family and community exactly who I had become during the years when they assumed I was merely surviving in a dead-end job. I was putting the finishing touches on the evidence compilation when I decided to take one final look at the guest list, cross-referencing it against everything I now knew about Marcus's involvement in the conspiracy. Most of the names were familiar family friends, Michael's relatives, and college acquaintances I had expected to see at the wedding. But as I reached the bottom of the list, one entry made my blood run cold with its implications. Emily discovers the fired partner's name on the guest list with a note: "Key witness will provide crucial testimony." The sight of Marcus Thornfield's name on my wedding guest list, brazenly listed as a key witness, crystallized the final element of preparation I needed to complete. If he intended to appear at my wedding as part of the conspiracy against me, then I needed to ensure that every piece of evidence I had gathered was presented with the kind of professional impact that would leave no doubt about who was telling the truth and who was orchestrating a campaign of destruction. I reached for my phone and dialed the direct line to my company's media production team, knowing that even at this late hour, at least one of them would be available for urgent projects. Sarah Kim answered on the third ring, her voice alert despite the time. "Emily, please tell me we have an emergency project that's more interesting than the budget presentations I've been editing all week," she said with the easy familiarity of someone who had worked with me on dozens of high-stakes corporate presentations. "Sarah, I need you to create the most important presentation of my career, and I need it to be absolutely flawless," I said, then launched into an explanation of what I required: a multimedia presentation that would combine audio recordings, financial documents, and visual evidence into a cohesive narrative that would expose the conspiracy without appearing vindictive or unprofessional. As I outlined the elements I wanted included, I could hear Sarah's keyboard clicking rapidly as she took notes, her professional instincts immediately grasping both the technical requirements and the strategic importance of what we were creating. "Emily, this isn't just a slideshow. This is evidence presentation that could be used in a courtroom," she said when I finished. "We're going to structure it like a documentary, letting the evidence speak for itself rather than relying on commentary or interpretation." The audio recordings will play over relevant visual elements and will use timeline graphics to show how the conspiracy developed over time. Sarah explained how she would begin with the financial evidence clear charts showing the unauthorized withdrawal of wedding funds and their transfer to cover Sophie's debts before moving to the recorded conversations that revealed the planning behind the sabotage. The presentation would conclude with security camera footage that Janet had already provided showing my family and Marcus in clandestine meetings that contradicted their public claims of concern for my well-being. The key is making sure everything flows naturally and builds to an undeniable conclusion, Sarah continued. By the time we're finished, anyone watching will understand exactly what was planned and why without feeling like they're being manipulated or propagandized. While Sarah worked on the technical production, I called David Kim to coordinate the presentation logistics with the dress transformation timing we had planned with Isabella. David's enthusiasm for the project had grown since our initial conversation, and I could hear the excitement in his voice as he described the technical setup he had arranged. "Emily, I've been thinking about this all day, and I want to propose some modifications to our original plan," he said. "Instead of just replacing their slideshow with your evidence, what if we create a seamless transition that uses their own introduction to launch into your presentation?" David explained how he could allow my father's speech and the initial slides from their presentation to play, normally creating the illusion that their sabotage was proceeding as planned. Then at the moment when Sophie moved to pull the dress string, he would trigger both the slideshow swap and the musical accompaniment for the transformation, creating a synchronized revelation that would be impossible to ignore or dismiss. "The beauty of this approach is that your family will have already committed themselves to their attack before they realize what's happening," he said. "They won't be able to claim they were joking or that the evidence is taken out of context because they'll have just finished executing exactly what the evidence shows them planning." As we refined the technical details, I found myself thinking about the speech I would need to give once the evidence presentation concluded. This would be my opportunity to reveal my true professional identity to the wedding guests, but it needed to be done in a way that elevated the conversation rather than appearing to seek revenge against my family. I spent the next hour crafting remarks that would frame the evidence presentation not as an attack on my family, but as a necessary defense of my integrity and my marriage. I planned to begin by thanking the guests for their presence at what should be a celebration of love and commitment. Then explain that recent events had made it necessary to address misconceptions about my character and capabilities. The speech would then transition into a revelation of my business success, presented not as a boast, but as context for understanding why I had become a target for the kind of sabotage the evidence had revealed. I would emphasize that my professional achievements had been built on the same values of honesty and integrity that I was bringing to my marriage, and that protecting those values required confronting those who would destroy them for personal gain. The goal is to emerge from this situation not just vindicated, but elevated, I murmured to myself as I refined the wording, thinking about how the speech would sound to the 200 guests who would witness this confrontation. By the time I finished drafting my remarks, Sarah had sent me a preview of the presentation that exceeded even my highest expectations. The evidence was presented with documentary-quality production values that made the conspiracy appear even more calculated and malicious than I had initially realized. The financial charts were devastating in their clarity. The audio recordings were undeniable in their implications, and the security footage provided visual confirmation that transformed speculation into proven fact. David confirmed that all technical elements were coordinated and ready for implementation with backup systems in place to ensure that nothing could prevent the presentation from proceeding exactly as planned. Janet had provided additional security camera angles that would document the family's reactions to the revelation, ensuring that any attempts to claim innocence or misunderstanding would be contradicted by their own recorded responses. As I prepared to finalize the last details of our counterattack, my phone chimed with a new message from the mysterious ally who had been providing intelligence about Marcus's broader plans. The message was marked with the highest security encryption, and as I read its contents, I felt a chill of apprehension that threatened to undermine all the confidence I had built throughout the evening. A message from the friend warns, He's planning something bigger. If you humiliate them, he'll destroy your business reputation. The warning about Marcus's escalating threats was still echoing in my mind when I heard a soft knock on my bedroom door, followed by Michael's familiar voice calling my name. My heart skipped with a mixture of joy and anxiety as I realized my fiancé had come to see me, but the timing couldn't have been worse. My laptop was open with confidential business documents spread across the screen, my phone was buzzing with encrypted messages, and I was in the middle of coordinating what amounted to a corporate counterintelligence operation. "Just a minute," I called out, quickly closing my laptop and sliding it under the bed while clearing away the notes and evidence portfolios I had been reviewing. But as I heard the door handle turn, I realized Michael wasn't waiting for permission to enter. "Emily, we need to talk," he said as he stepped into the room, and something in his tone made me look up at him with sharp attention. The easy smile and gentle warmth that usually characterized his expressions had been replaced by something that looked uncomfortably like suspicion. Michael closed the door behind him and leaned against it, studying my face with an intensity that made me suddenly aware of how I must appear disheveled from hours of secret planning, surrounded by the lingering evidence of activities I couldn't explain, without revealing everything I had been hiding from him for years. "I've been downstairs talking with your family," he began, and I felt my stomach drop as I realized what conversation he might have overheard. "Sophie made some interesting comments about your other life and how different you are from what people think. She seemed to find it amusing that I don't know who I'm really marrying." The casual cruelty in Sophie's words didn't surprise me, but the fact that she had chosen to target Michael with her insinuations felt like a new level of maliciousness. She wasn't just trying to destroy me anymore, she was trying to poison the one relationship that mattered more to me than any business success I had achieved. "Michael, whatever Sophie said, you know she's always been jealous and—" "This isn't about Sophie," he interrupted, and the firmness in his voice stopped me mid-sentence. "This is about the fact that for the past 3 weeks you've been taking mysterious phone calls at all hours, disappearing to handle work emergencies that seem far too complex for someone who files paperwork at a small consulting firm, and acting like you're preparing for something much bigger than a wedding." I watched him pace across my childhood bedroom, his hands gesturing with the kind of controlled frustration that suggested he had been thinking about this conversation for days. The rational part of my mind recognized that his concerns were entirely reasonable. I had been secretive and evasive, and from his perspective, my behavior must seem inexplicable and worrying. "And tonight?" Michael continued. "I've watched you take at least 6 phone calls, each one ending with you looking more confident and determined than the last. You're not acting like someone who's nervous about her wedding, Emily. You're acting like someone who's planning a corporate takeover." The accuracy of his observation would have been amusing under different circumstances, but the pain in his voice made it impossible to appreciate the irony. I had been trying to protect him from the complexity and potential danger of my real professional life, but my protective instincts had created exactly the kind of distance and mistrust I had been trying to avoid. "I can explain everything," I started, but Michael held up a hand to stop me. "Can you?" "Because I've been trying to understand why you seem to know so much about business strategy for someone who claims to work in administration. I've noticed how you analyze news stories about corporate mergers like someone with insider knowledge. I've seen you reading financial publications that would be completely irrelevant to a filing clerk." Each observation was accurate, and I realized with growing dismay that Michael had been far more observant of my behavior than I had given him credit for. In my effort to maintain the fiction of my simple office job, I had apparently been dropping clues about my real life without even realizing it. "And then there's this," Michael said, pulling out his phone and holding it toward me. On the screen was a screenshot of an email that had been visible on my laptop when he entered the room, one of the encrypted messages about the $1 million Singapore expansion deal that I hadn't fully cleared from my screen before hiding the computer. The email was partially visible, showing enough text to make it clear that it was discussing significant financial transactions and international business partnerships. The sender's address was listed as coming from the executive offices of a company that Michael would certainly recognize as a major player in the consulting industry. "I saw this when I came in," he said quietly. "Emily, this email is about deals worth more money than most small companies see in a decade. Either you're somehow involved in financial transactions that dwarf anything you've ever mentioned to me, or someone is sending you extremely sensitive business information by mistake." I stared at the phone screen, realizing that the moment I had been dreading and preparing for had arrived not through my family's sabotage or Marcus's revenge, but through my own carelessness and Michael's legitimate concern for our relationship. The woman I fell in love with was honest and straightforward. Michael continued, his voice growing softer but more serious. "She didn't have secrets, and she didn't make me feel like I was missing crucial pieces of who she really was. But the woman I've been living with for the past few months feels like someone I'm still getting to know, and not in a good way." He sat down on the edge of my bed, close enough that I could see the genuine confusion and hurt in his eyes. This wasn't anger or accusation. It was the pain of someone who was beginning to doubt whether he truly knew the person he was planning to marry. "Emily, I've tried to convince myself that you're just stressed about the wedding or that you're dealing with family pressure in ways I don't understand. But tonight, watching you coordinate phone calls and handle what are obviously complex business negotiations, I can't ignore the obvious conclusion anymore." The silence between us stretched uncomfortably as I struggled to find words that could bridge the gap between the truth I needed to tell and the protection I had been trying to provide. I had spent years building walls between my professional success and my personal relationships, and now those walls were threatening to destroy the most important connection in my life. Michael looked directly into my eyes, and I saw not just confusion, but a deep sadness that made my heart ache with regret for all the months of unnecessary secrecy. Michael confronts Emily. "I feel like I'm marrying a stranger. Who are you really, Emily?" The pain in Michael's eyes stayed with me long after he left my room. His question echoing in the silence like an accusation I couldn't answer without destroying the careful protections I had built around both of us. But as I sat alone with the weight of his doubt and the magnitude of tomorrow's confrontation, I realized that the time for half-truths and protective lies had finally come to an end. I pulled my laptop back onto the bed and opened the secure portal to my company's cloud storage system, the same military-grade encryption service we use to protect our most sensitive client information. Over the next hour, I methodically uploaded every piece of evidence I had gathered: the audio recordings of my family's conspiracy, the financial documents proving the wedding fund theft, the security camera footage Janet had provided, and the correspondence showing Marcus's involvement in orchestrating the entire sabotage operation. As each file transferred to the secure servers, I felt a sense of finality settling over me. Tomorrow would mark the end of the double life I had been living, regardless of how the confrontation played out. Win or lose, the careful separation I had maintained between Emily the office worker and Emily the CEO would be permanently shattered. I created duplicate copies of everything and sent them through encrypted channels to Robert Chen's legal team and to my grandmother's secure email account, ensuring that if anything happened to me or my primary files, the evidence would survive to tell the story. The methodical process of safeguarding the proof gave me a sense of control that helped quiet the anxiety that had been building since Michael's confrontation. With the evidence secured, I turned to the more difficult task of finding words that could bridge the gap between the truth Michael deserved and the protection I still wanted to provide him. I opened a new document and stared at the blank page for several minutes before beginning to type. "My dearest Michael," I wrote, "by the time you read this letter, you will know that the woman you fell in love with has been hiding something that will change how you see everything about our relationship and our future together." I paused, considering how to explain years of secrecy in a way that wouldn't sound like manipulation or betrayal. The words came slowly at first, then in a rush as I found my voice. "The office job you think I have is actually a cover for the business I've been building since college. I am the CEO and majority owner of Chen Strategic Consulting, a company that now employs 43 people and generates annual revenues that place us among the fastest-growing firms in our industry. I have been hiding this from my family and from you, not out of dishonesty, but out of a desperate desire to protect both my business and our relationship from the complications that would arise if certain people knew the truth about my success. As I continued writing, explaining about the threats my family posed to my professional reputation and the revenge Marcus had been planning, I found myself finally articulating fears I had never spoken aloud. The letter became both a confession and an explanation, an apology for the secrecy and a plea for understanding about why I had felt it was necessary. I know that asking you to trust me through tomorrow's wedding without knowing all the details is unfair, I wrote near the end. But I promise you that after we are married and this crisis is resolved, I will share everything with you, my financial records, my business plans, my fears and dreams for our future together. You deserve a wife who can be completely honest with you, and I want to be that woman more than I want to protect the secrets that have kept us apart. I sealed the letter in an envelope with Michael's name written in my careful script, planning to leave it where he would find it before the wedding ceremony began. It wasn't a complete explanation, but it was a bridge toward the transparency he deserved and I needed to offer. As I finished addressing the envelope, I heard a soft knock on my door and found my grandmother standing in the hallway, still dressed despite the late hour. "I couldn't sleep," she said quietly. "Too much excitement about tomorrow and too many memories of other family confrontations over the years." I invited her in, grateful for her presence during what felt like the longest night of my life. She settled into the chair by my window and studied my face with the perceptive gaze that had always made her the wisest person I knew. "You've been busy tonight," she observed, nodding toward my laptop and the scattered papers that marked hours of preparation. "Getting ready for battle, I assume." "Something like that," I replied, then found myself sharing more than I had intended about the evidence I had secured and the counter-strategies I had coordinated. My grandmother listened without interruption, occasionally nodding as if my preparations confirmed conclusions she had already reached. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment before reaching into her purse and pulling out a folder I didn't recognize. "Emily, there's something I need to tell you before tomorrow," she said, opening the folder to reveal documents that made my heart skip with surprise. "I haven't been entirely honest with you about how much I know about your business success." The papers she showed me were investment records, legal documents that bore both our names and signatures I remembered signing years ago when I was scrambling to find the capital to expand my fledgling company. "You were one of my angel investors," I whispered, staring at documents that showed my grandmother had provided $15,000 during my company's critical early funding round. "But you signed everything under your maiden name and the lawyer said the investor wanted to remain anonymous. I wanted to support you without creating family complications," she explained with a smile that reminded me of my own strategic thinking. "I've been watching your company grow from the inside, receiving quarterly reports and annual statements that showed me exactly what kind of leader and businesswoman you were becoming." The revelation transformed everything I thought I knew about my grandmother's faith in me. She hadn't just been offering emotional support and family loyalty. She had been making calculated business decisions based on her assessment of my capabilities and potential. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" I asked. "Because you needed to succeed on your own merits without feeling beholden to family assistance," she replied. "But Emily, watching you build something extraordinary while your parents dismissed your achievements has been one of the proudest experiences of my life. Tomorrow, when they try to tear you down, remember that you have at least one family member who has always known exactly what you're capable of accomplishing." As my grandmother prepared to leave, I felt a sense of completion that went beyond mere preparation for tomorrow's confrontation. I had secured my evidence, attempted to explain myself to Michael, and discovered that my greatest ally had been supporting me from the very beginning of my journey. I was walking her to the door when I noticed a white envelope that someone had slipped underneath it while we were talking. My name was written on the front in block letters that disguised any identifying handwriting, and something about its presence sent a chill down my spine. Emily finds a threatening note slipped under her door. "We know about your counterplan tomorrow. You'll lose everything." The threatening note lay crumpled in my wastebasket as I stood before the full-length mirror in the bridal suite at Malibu Estate, adjusting the outer layer of Isabella's transformation dress one final time. Whatever Marcus and my family thought they knew about my counterplan, it was too late for them to stop what was already in motion. The morning sun streamed through the estate's floor-to-ceiling windows, casting golden light across what would soon become the stage for the most important performance of my life. From my vantage point on the second floor, I could see the breathtaking ballroom below where exactly 200 guests were taking their seats among arrangements of white roses and crystal that I had personally selected during months of careful planning. Every detail of the venue reflected the organizational skills I had honed through years of managing complex corporate events, the lighting positioned to create maximum visual impact, the sound system calibrated for perfect acoustics throughout the space, and the seating arrangement, designed to ensure that every guest would have an unobstructed view of what was about to unfold. The Malibu Estate had been my first choice, not just for its beauty, but for its technical capabilities. The ballroom's advanced audio-visual system would serve David Kim's multimedia presentation perfectly, while the strategic placement of discrete security cameras ensured that Janet would be able to document every moment of the evening from multiple angles. Even the staging area where I would deliver my speech had been selected with careful attention to sight lines and lighting that would frame the dress transformation for maximum dramatic effect. As I watched the guests filing into their seats, I felt a familiar surge of confidence that came from knowing I had prepared for every contingency. Victoria Hartwell and Robert Chen were already seated at the head table, their presence a visible reminder that Emily Chen was not the powerless victim my family expected to humiliate. Michael stood near the altar talking quietly with his groomsmen, and I could see him periodically glancing toward the bridal suite with an expression that suggested he had found and read the letter I had left in his hotel room. The ceremony itself proceeded exactly as we had rehearsed, with Michael's eyes never leaving mine as we exchanged vows that carried new meaning in light of the revelations that awaited us both. When he slipped the wedding ring onto my finger, I saw understanding and trust in his expression. That told me my letter had accomplished what I had hoped. He was willing to stand beside me through whatever storm was coming, even if he didn't yet fully understand its magnitude. But it was during the transition from ceremony to reception that I caught my first glimpse of Marcus Thornfield among the crowd of guests, his presence like a dark cloud on an otherwise perfect day. He stood near the back of the ballroom dressed in an expensive suit that couldn't disguise the calculating expression he wore as he surveyed the room with the intensity of someone mapping out a battlefield. Our eyes met briefly across the crowd, and his smile carried the cold satisfaction of someone who believed he held all the winning cards. I maintained my composure and continued greeting guests as if I hadn't noticed him, but I made a mental note of his position relative to the areas where our counterattack would unfold. Janet had confirmed that all security cameras were recording, and I knew that every interaction he had with my family members would be documented for future reference. It was just after the cocktail hour began that Sophie made her entrance, and I had to admit that her sense of drama was as perfectly timed as it was entirely inappropriate. She swept into the ballroom wearing a white dress that was obviously designed to compete with my bridal gown, a flowing creation with elaborate beading that caught the light with every movement. The gasps and murmurs from guests who noticed her choice confirmed that she had achieved exactly the shock value she intended. But watching Sophie pose and preen in her white dress, I felt only a mixture of pity and anticipation. She had no idea that Isabella had prepared a special surprise specifically for her attention-seeking outfit, or that her dramatic entrance was actually setting the stage for her own spectacular downfall. The confidence radiating from her every gesture told me that she was already savoring her anticipated triumph, completely unaware that she was walking directly into a trap that would turn her moment of supposed victory into the most humiliating experience of her life. As the reception formally began and guests took their seats for dinner, I noticed Sophie positioning herself strategically near the area where I would be standing to give my thank you speech. She was clearly preparing to execute the dress sabotage exactly as she had planned, her fingers occasionally reaching toward her purse, where I assumed she had concealed whatever tools she thought she might need to ensure my humiliation was complete. The sight of her preparation filled me with a cold satisfaction that reminded me of the feeling I got when a difficult business negotiation shifted in my favor. Sophie thought she was orchestrating my destruction, but what she was actually doing was providing me with the perfect opportunity to reveal exactly what happened when someone underestimated Emily Chen. As the dinner service concluded and the moment for speeches approached, I caught sight of Sophie leaning close to Marcus Thornfield, both of them watching me with the predatory intensity of hunters who thought they had cornered their prey. The conversation between them was too quiet for me to hear from across the room, but their body language radiated the confidence of people who believed they held absolute power over the evening's outcome. I moved toward the staging area where David Kim had positioned the microphone and projection system, each step bringing me closer to the confrontation I had been preparing for since the moment I overheard their conspiracy. Around me, 200 guests settled into expectant silence, unaware that they were about to witness something far more dramatic than the traditional wedding toast they were anticipating. Sophie whispers to a guest while eyeing Emily, "In a few minutes she'll be the laughingstock of all 200 people here." The sound of silverware clinking against crystal glasses filled the ballroom as my father rose from his seat at the head table, commanding the attention of all 200 guests with the natural authority that had made him successful in his own career. I watched from my position near the microphone as he straightened his tie and cleared his throat, preparing to deliver what everyone expected would be a loving father's tribute to his daughter on her wedding day. But I could see the calculation behind his smile, the way his eyes swept across the assembled guests as if he were assessing an audience before a particularly important performance. This wasn't going to be a tribute, it was going to be character assassination disguised as paternal concern, and every word had been carefully crafted to set up the humiliation that was supposed to follow. "Ladies and gentlemen," my father began, his voice carrying easily across the ballroom, thanks to the excellent acoustics I had insisted upon during the venue planning. "It's a father's privilege to speak about his daughter on her wedding day, and I want to share with you some thoughts about Emily that I think will help you understand the young woman she has become." The opening was perfectly pitched, warm, authoritative, and designed to make the audience receptive to whatever revelations would follow. I had to admit that my father was skilled at public speaking, and under different circumstances, I might have been proud to be the subject of his remarks. "Emily has always been our dreamer," he continued, and I caught the subtle emphasis on the word that suggested foolish fantasy rather than admirable ambition. Even as a child, she had grand ideas about what she wanted to accomplish, always convinced that she was destined for something greater than the rest of us could see. Around me, guests nodded and smiled, interpreting his words as the affectionate teasing of a proud parent. But I recognized the setup he was constructing. He was establishing me as delusional and grandiose, someone whose perception of reality couldn't be trusted. Of course, as parents, we tried to help Emily develop more realistic expectations about her capabilities and her future. My father went on, his tone growing more serious as he began to build toward his central theme. We encouraged her to focus on practical goals, to find satisfaction in honest work, rather than chasing fantasies that might lead to disappointment and failure. I saw several guests exchange glances, beginning to sense that this speech was taking an unusual direction for a wedding celebration. But my father's delivery was so smooth, his manner so convincingly concerned, that most of the audience was still giving him the benefit of the doubt. "And I'm proud to say that Emily did eventually find stable employment," he said with a patronizing smile that made my hands clench into fists. "She's spent the last several years working as an administrative assistant, learning the value of supporting other people's success rather than pursuing unrealistic ambitions of her own." The description was designed to diminish me in front of everyone who mattered: my new husband's family, our college friends, the professional contacts who had come to celebrate what they thought was simply a personal milestone. My father was methodically stripping away any possibility that the audience might view me as someone worthy of respect or admiration. As he spoke, I noticed my mother rising from her seat and making her way toward David Kim's DJ station with a USB drive in her hand. She moved with the confident purpose of someone executing a plan she had rehearsed many times, completely unaware that her every step was being recorded by Janet's security cameras, and that the evidence she thought she was about to present had been replaced with something very different. "Of course, marriage is about accepting people as they really are," my father continued, "and Michael has shown admirable patience in dealing with Emily's tendency toward exaggeration and self-importance. It takes a special kind of man to see past someone's pretensions and love them anyway." The insult was delivered with such apparent sincerity that it took several seconds for its full impact to register with the audience. I saw Michael's jaw tighten as he recognized the attack for what it was, and I felt a surge of gratitude that he was beginning to understand why I had needed to prepare so carefully for this moment. I watched my mother hand the USB drive to David, who accepted it with the professional courtesy of someone who had no reason to question what appeared to be a routine request from the mother of the bride. She had no idea that she was actually helping to trigger the counterattack that would expose everything she and my family had been planning. "I think it's time we showed you all some pictures that really capture Emily's character over the years," my father announced, gesturing toward the large screen that had been set up for what the guests assumed would be a nostalgic slideshow of childhood memories and family moments. The anticipation in the room was palpable, as guests turned their attention to the screen expecting to see the kind of embarrassing but endearing photos that were traditional at wedding receptions. My father's smile grew wider as he prepared to deliver what he clearly believed would be the decisive blow in his campaign to humiliate me. But as I stood there watching my mother return to her seat with the satisfied expression of someone who had just lit a fuse, I felt the familiar calm that came over me during the most critical moments of business negotiations. This was the moment when all of my preparation would either succeed or fail, when the careful planning and strategic thinking that had built my company would be put to the ultimate test. I caught David's eye and gave him the subtle signal we had rehearsed, a slight nod that would have been invisible to anyone who wasn't specifically watching for it. His almost imperceptible response told me that everything was ready, that the real slideshow was queued up and waiting, and that the audio-visual presentation that would change everything was about to begin. The confidence I felt in that moment wasn't the desperate hope of someone gambling everything on a single desperate move. It was the quiet certainty of a CEO who had analyzed every variable, prepared for every contingency, and was now ready to watch her opponents destroy themselves with their own overconfidence. My father moved closer to the microphone, his smile taking on a predatory quality as he prepared to deliver what he thought would be my final humiliation. The 200 guests were completely focused on him now, unaware that they were about to witness something very different from what anyone had expected. Father pauses dramatically, smiling coldly at the 200 guests. "Now, it's time to show everyone who Emily really is." My father's declaration hung in the air as David Kim triggered the multimedia presentation, but I barely registered the beginning of what I knew would be a devastating slideshow because my attention was focused entirely on Sophie's movement through the crowd. She was positioning herself exactly where Isabella and I had anticipated, her face glowing with malicious anticipation as she prepared to execute what she believed would be the perfect finale to my public destruction. I stepped up to the microphone and began the gracious thank you speech I had prepared, expressing genuine gratitude to our guests for sharing this special day with Michael and me. My words were heartfelt and sincere, the kind of bride's remarks that would have seemed perfectly normal under any other circumstances. But I could feel the electric tension in the room as two very different audiences waited for completely different revelations. Most of the 200 guests were settling in to listen to traditional wedding sentiments while watching what they assumed would be a nostalgic slideshow. But I could see Sophie edging closer with predatory focus, her fingers already reaching toward the concealed string that she thought would trigger my ultimate humiliation. Behind her, Marcus Thornfield watched with the cold satisfaction of someone who believed he was about to witness the destruction of an enemy who had dared to challenge him. "I especially want to thank my family," I said, making direct eye contact with my parents as they sat beaming with false pride. for teaching me so much about the importance of truth and integrity in all our relationships. The irony would have been amusing under different circumstances, but I felt only a focused calm as I continued speaking, while simultaneously tracking Sophie's position and timing. She was almost in range now, close enough to reach the hidden string that Isabella had transformed from an instrument of sabotage into the trigger for the most spectacular dress reveal anyone in that ballroom had ever witnessed. Marriage is about knowing and accepting each other completely. I continued, my voice carrying clearly across the ballroom as I moved into position under the lighting that David had adjusted specifically for this moment. It's about trust, honesty, and the courage to show your true self even when that makes you vulnerable. Sophie was directly behind me now, her hand reaching toward my back with the confident precision of someone who had rehearsed this moment many times. I could see her reflection in the mirror ball that hung above the dance floor, her face twisted with anticipation as she prepared to pull the string that would supposedly strip away my dignity in front of everyone who mattered to me. The moment her fingers found the string, I felt a surge of pure satisfaction that reminded me of closing the biggest deal of my business career. This was it, the instant when months of careful planning would either vindicate my strategy or reveal it as an elaborate miscalculation that would cost me everything. Sophie yanked the string with vicious force, expecting the satisfying resistance of fabric tearing and seams giving way under pressure. Instead, she encountered the smooth release of Isabella's carefully engineered breakaway system, and I felt the outer layer of my dress begin its choreographed separation exactly as we had designed it. But instead of the catastrophic wardrobe malfunction Sophie had engineered, what followed was pure magic that exceeded even my highest expectations for what Isabella could accomplish. The outer dress didn't fall apart. It fell away in a cascade of silk panels that floated down around me like enormous flower petals. Each piece weighted and balanced to create a graceful spiral as it descended toward the ballroom floor. The transformation revealed the breathtaking inner gown that Isabella had crafted specifically for this moment, a creation that transformed me from a traditional bride into something that belonged in a fairy tale. The crystal-studded bodice caught every light in the ballroom and threw it back in prismatic sparkles that made me appear to glow from within, while the flowing skirt seemed to shimmer with its own inner fire, as the fabric moved with each breath I took. The effect was so dramatic, so utterly unexpected, that the entire ballroom fell into stunned silence as 200 guests tried to process what they had just witnessed. For a moment that felt like eternity, nobody moved or spoke as they stared at what appeared to be a magical transformation that had turned their friend and family member into a living constellation. Then the silence shattered into thunderous applause, mixed with gasps of amazement and shouts of "Wow!" that echoed off the ballroom's high ceiling. Guests leaped to their feet in spontaneous ovation, many of them pulling out their phones to capture photos of what they clearly believed was the most spectacular planned costume change they had ever seen at a wedding. "That was incredible!" someone shouted from the back of the room, while others called out their amazement at what they assumed was an elaborate surprise I had arranged for their entertainment. Victoria Hartwell was applauding with the kind of admiration usually reserved for breakthrough business presentations, while Robert Chen nodded with the appreciation of someone who recognized masterful strategic planning when he saw it. I stood in the center of it all, smiling with the confidence of someone who had just pulled off the most important performance of her life, feeling truly beautiful and powerful for the first time since arriving at my childhood home. The crystal gown caught the ballroom lights and sent rainbows dancing across the walls and ceiling, creating a visual spectacle that made me feel like I had stepped out of a dream and into a moment of pure triumph. Michael's face showed wonder and pride as he realized that the woman he had married possessed resources and capabilities. He was only beginning to understand, while my grandmother's expression radiated the satisfaction of someone whose investment in her granddaughter had just paid dividends beyond anything she could have imagined. But as the applause began to die down, and guests started returning to their seats, still buzzing with excitement about the amazing transformation they had witnessed, I heard a sound that brought me even greater satisfaction than their admiration. As the applause dies down, Sophie screams in frustration, "That wasn't supposed to happen! She knew! She knew what I did to her dress!" Sophie's desperate outburst cut through the ballroom's excitement like a knife. Her words immediately shifting the atmosphere from celebration to confusion, as the 200 guests tried to understand what she meant about knowing what she had done to my dress. But before anyone could fully process her admission of sabotage, the large projection screen that had been dormant during the dress transformation suddenly blazed to life with the professional presentation that Sarah Kim had created from my evidence files. The opening slide displayed a simple title, "The Truth About Tonight," in elegant typography that immediately commanded attention. David Kim had timed the presentation perfectly, allowing Sophie's outburst to serve as an introduction to what the audience was about to witness. As the title faded, it was replaced by crystal-clear audio that filled the ballroom through the estate's premium sound system. My father's voice emerged from the speakers with devastating clarity. "The slideshow is perfect. I found all those old photos from when she was going through that awkward phase in high school. The guests will get quite a show." The recording played over a timeline graphic that showed when and where the conversation had taken place, lending documentary credibility to what might otherwise have been dismissed as taken out of context. I watched 200 faces transform from confusion to shock as the guests heard my own father describe his plan to humiliate me with embarrassing childhood photos. The professional quality of the presentation made it impossible to dismiss as fabricated or manipulated. Sarah's team had used the same production standards we employed for million-dollar client presentations. Sophie's voice joined my father's in the next clip. "I loosened the seams at strategic points. The dress will hold together just fine for the ceremony and the photos. But I also sewed in a nearly invisible string along the back seam. During the reception, when Emily's up there giving her thank you speech to all 200 guests, I'll be standing right behind her. One little pull and the entire dress will fall apart." The gasps that rippled through the ballroom were audible as guests realized they had just witnessed the exact sabotage Sophie had described in her own words. The dress transformation that had seemed like magical theater suddenly took on new meaning as they understood it had been Emily's counterattack against a calculated attempt to destroy her dignity. But the financial evidence that followed was what truly stunned the audience into silence. Bank statements appeared on screen with clear graphics highlighting unauthorized withdrawals from the wedding fund, while my mother's voice provided damning narration. "At least Emily found someone willing to marry her. We can use the rest of that wedding money to cover Sophie's debts. It's not like Emily will ever need it for anything important." The documentation was irrefutable professional accounting analysis that showed exactly how much money had been stolen, when it had been transferred, and where it had gone. Several guests were already pulling out their phones to photograph the evidence, recognizing its significance, even as they struggled to process the betrayal it revealed. As security camera footage began playing on the screen, showing my family and Marcus Thornfield in clandestine meetings that contradicted everything they had publicly claimed, I stepped forward to address the stunned silence that had fallen over the ballroom. "I know this is a lot to process," I said calmly, my voice carrying the quiet authority I used in boardroom presentations. "But I think it's important that everyone understands who I really am and why I became a target for this kind of sabotage." The 200 guests were completely focused on me now, their attention absolute, as they waited to understand how the woman they thought they knew had been capable of gathering such comprehensive evidence and orchestrating such a sophisticated counterattack. "For the past 5 years, I have been the CEO and majority owner of Chen Strategic Consulting," I announced, and the silence that followed was so complete I could hear the subtle hum of the building's ventilation system. "My company employs 43 people and generates annual revenues that place us among the fastest-growing consulting firms in our industry." I saw jaws drop throughout the ballroom as guests tried to reconcile this revelation with everything they thought they knew about me. But it was the reaction from the business professionals among the attendees that provided the most satisfying validation of what I had accomplished. Victoria Hartwell was nodding with obvious approval, her expression showing the respect of one successful CEO for another. Robert Chen had a slight smile that suggested he was impressed by the strategic thinking behind my counterattack. Several other guests were beginning to recognize the implications of what they were hearing. Emily Chen wasn't the victim her family had portrayed, but a business leader who had used corporate-level resources to defend herself against a calculated attack. I used my company's cybersecurity team to gather the security footage you're seeing. I continued gesturing toward the screen where camera angles captured my family's conspiracy meetings from multiple perspectives. Our media production team created this presentation using the same standards we employ for Fortune 500 client deliverables, and our legal team has reviewed everything to ensure it meets evidentiary standards for potential court proceedings. The transformation in the audience was remarkable to witness. Shock was giving way to admiration as guests realized they were seeing masterful strategic planning in action. This wasn't just wedding day drama. It was a demonstration of executive leadership under pressure, and many of the business professionals present were recognizing it as such. The reason I kept my success private, I explained, was to protect both my business and my personal relationships from exactly the kind of sabotage you've just witnessed. My family's conspiracy proves that my caution was justified. More security footage played on the screen showing Sophie practicing her dress sabotage technique while my parents provided encouragement and advice. The visual evidence was devastating in its clarity, leaving no room for alternative interpretations or claims of misunderstanding. But it was the final audio clip that provided the most damning evidence of all. As my mother's voice emerged from the speakers with perfect acoustic clarity, her words carrying across the silent ballroom with devastating impact. The recording ends with Mother's voice clearly stating, "After her dress falls apart, we'll use the rest of the wedding fund to pay him off." The weight of my mother's recorded confession hung in the air like a verdict that no one could dispute. But it was the movement beside me that drew my attention away from the stunned faces of the 200 guests. Michael stepped forward from where he had been standing with his groomsmen, his expression showing none of the confusion or betrayal I had feared seeing. Instead, his face radiated a pride and determination that made my heart swell with love and gratitude. Without hesitation, he took my hand in both of his, the gesture so natural and supportive that it immediately drew the attention of every guest in the ballroom. When he spoke, his voice carried clearly across the silent room with the confidence of someone who had finally been given the opportunity to say something he had been holding back for far too long. "I want everyone here to know something," Michael declared, turning to address the 200 guests directly while keeping my hand firmly clasped in his. "I'm proud that she's a brilliant entrepreneur and my wife. I have always suspected that Emily was capable of far more than she let most people see, and watching her handle this situation with such intelligence and grace only confirms what I've known about her character from the beginning." The sincerity in his voice was unmistakable, and I felt tears of relief and joy threatening to spill over as I realized that my fears about his reaction to my secrecy had been unfounded. He wasn't angry about the deception, he was proud of the strength it had taken to build something extraordinary while protecting it from people who would have tried to destroy it. The woman I married didn't need to prove herself to me by revealing her business success. Michael continued his words, carrying an emotional weight that seemed to resonate throughout the ballroom. But seeing her use those skills to defend our marriage and expose this betrayal makes me even more honored to be her husband. The response from the 200 guests was immediate and overwhelming. What began as scattered applause quickly swelled into a thunderous ovation that seemed to shake the ballroom's crystal chandeliers. But it wasn't just the sound of clapping hands that filled the space. It was the emotional energy of people who had just witnessed something that transcended typical wedding day drama. I could see tears streaming down faces throughout the crowd, as guests were moved not just by the revelation of my business success, but by the display of unwavering love and support that Michael was showing in front of everyone who mattered to us. Victoria Hartwell was wiping her eyes while applauding her expression, showing the kind of respect that one successful leader shows another who has earned their admiration through actions rather than words. Even guests who had initially seemed skeptical about the evidence I had presented were now nodding in approval and joining the applause, their attitudes completely transformed by Michael's public declaration of support. The standing ovation continued for what felt like several minutes, creating a moment of pure emotional triumph that validated not just my business achievements, but the love that had motivated me to fight for our future together. But as the applause began to subside, and guests started to settle back into their seats, I noticed that Sophie had been frantically trying to get attention throughout Michael's declaration and the crowd's response. She had been waving her arms and shouting something that was completely drowned out by the applause, her face growing increasingly red with frustration as she realized that no one was paying attention to her attempts to speak. The contrast between the respect and admiration being shown to me and the complete dismissal Sophie was experiencing seemed to drive her into a state of desperation I had never seen before. Her carefully constructed facade of superiority and control was crumbling in real time as she faced the reality that her sabotage had not only failed, but had transformed me into the center of positive attention she had always craved for herself. "Listen to me," Sophie screamed, as the applause finally died down enough for her voice to carry across the ballroom. "You're all being fooled. She's not the person you think she is." But her frantic protests only served to highlight how completely she had lost credibility with the assembled guests. People were turning away from her or shaking their heads with obvious disgust at her continued attempts to attack someone who had just been vindicated so thoroughly. The more desperately she tried to regain control of the narrative, the more pathetic and unstable she appeared to everyone watching. "This is all lies and manipulation." Sophie continued, her voice growing shriller as she realized she was losing the audience entirely. "Emily planned this whole thing to make herself look good and destroy her own family." The irony of her accusation was lost on no one. Sophie was essentially confessing that there had indeed been a plan to destroy someone, while simultaneously revealing that she viewed Emily's success as an attack on the family rather than an achievement to be celebrated. Her words were having exactly the opposite effect of what she intended, further cementing the guests' support for Emily while exposing her own malicious motivations. I watched with a mixture of pity and satisfaction as Sophie's composure completely disintegrated before the 200 witnesses who had come to celebrate what was supposed to be the happiest day of my life. She had been so confident in her ability to humiliate me that she had never prepared for the possibility that her sabotage would backfire so spectacularly. Sophie desperately pulls out an envelope, screaming to the 200 guests, "I have proof that will destroy everything she just said." Sophie's trembling hands fumbled with the envelope as she pulled out what appeared to be photographs and documents, her face desperate with the kind of panic that comes from watching a carefully constructed plan crumble in real time. She held the papers above her head like weapons, her voice cracking as she addressed the 200 guests who were now watching her with a mixture of pity and disgust. "These photos prove Emily has been lying about everything," Sophie shrieked, waving the documents frantically. "She's been manipulating all of you with fake evidence and elaborate staging. This whole presentation is just another one of her business schemes." But before Sophie could begin displaying whatever fabricated evidence she had prepared as her final desperate gambit, Janet's voice came through the sound system with calm, professional authority. "I'm sorry to interrupt," Janet announced from her position at the technical control station, "but I think the guests should see some additional security footage that provides context for what we're witnessing right now." The projection screen immediately filled with crystal-clear security camera footage showing Sophie in animated conversation with Marcus Thornfield in what appeared to be my parents' living room 3 days earlier. The timestamp and camera angle proved the meeting had taken place while Sophie was supposedly helping with wedding preparations, and the audio that accompanied the footage was devastating in its clarity. "Emily thinks she's so smart with her little business," Sophie's recorded voice said with vicious satisfaction. "But she has no idea that I've been planning this for months. Once we destroy her reputation at the wedding, Marcus can take down her company and we'll finally put her in her place." The footage continued, showing Sophie coaching our parents on their roles in the conspiracy while Marcus provided detailed intelligence about my business operations and client relationships. The evidence was irrefutable. Sophie wasn't just a willing participant in the sabotage plot, she was clearly its primary architect and driving force. I can't wait to see her face when she realizes everyone knows what a fraud she is. Sophie's recorded voice continued as the 200 guests watched in stunned silence. She's always acted like she was better than us, but tomorrow she'll be nothing but a laughingstock. The contrast between the desperate woman standing before us now and the calculating manipulator on screen was stark enough to make several guests gasp in recognition of just how thoroughly they had been deceived about Sophie's true nature. Michael stepped forward again, his expression grim as he addressed the ballroom with the kind of moral authority that comes from finally being able to tell an important truth. "Since we're revealing everything tonight," he said, his voice carrying clearly to all 200 guests, "I think everyone should know that Sophie has repeatedly tried to seduce me over the past 6 months. She sent inappropriate messages, shown up at my apartment uninvited, and made it clear that she believed she could break up our engagement if she just tried hard enough." The revelation sent a wave of shocked murmurs through the ballroom as guests processed the implications of what Michael was revealing. Sophie's face went white, then red, as she realized that her secret campaign to steal her sister's fiancé was being exposed to everyone who mattered in her social circle. "That's not true," Sophie screamed, but her denial only made her appear more desperate and unstable. "He's lying to protect Emily's fake story." I pulled out my phone and accessed the folder where I had stored the evidence of Sophie's affair with Marcus's business associate, a married man whose wife had provided me with photographic proof in exchange for information about Marcus's revenge plot against my company. "While we're discussing Sophie's character," I said calmly, projecting the photos onto the screen where they joined the security footage in creating a comprehensive picture of Sophie's deception, "I think our guests should see these images of her with David Marshall, whose wife contacted me last week after discovering their affair." The photographs showed Sophie and the married man in compromising situations that left no doubt about the nature of their relationship, while timestamps proved the affair had been ongoing for months, while she publicly criticized Emily's moral character and relationship choices. The transformation in the guests' attitude toward Sophie was complete and devastating. What little sympathy she might have retained as a family member, caught up in wedding day drama, evaporated, as the evidence revealed her as someone who had systematically betrayed everyone who trusted her, her parents, her sister Michael, and even Marcus's business associate's wife. "You're all being manipulated," Sophie screamed, but her words fell on ears that had heard too much truth to be swayed by desperate lies. "Emily planned all of this to make herself look good." The irony of her accusation was lost on no one. Sophie was essentially admitting that there had been a plan to make someone look bad, while simultaneously revealing her own capacity for elaborate deception and manipulation. A guest whispers loudly enough for others to hear, "Now I understand why Sophie orchestrated all this. She wanted Emily's money." The guest's whispered observation about Sophie's financial motives provided the perfect transition into the final element of evidence I needed to present to the 200 witnesses who had just watched my sister's credibility evaporate before their eyes. I nodded to David Kim, who immediately brought up the comprehensive financial analysis that my company's accounting team had prepared using the same forensic techniques we employed for corporate fraud investigations. "Since we're discussing motives," I said, addressing the stunned ballroom with the calm authority of someone presenting findings to a board of directors, "I think everyone should understand the financial crimes that made this conspiracy necessary for my family." The projection screen filled with professional charts and graphs that traced the flow of money from the wedding fund into accounts controlled by Sophie with timestamps and transaction records that painted an irrefutable picture of systematic theft. The presentation was designed using the same standards my company employed for million-dollar client deliverables, making it impossible for anyone to dismiss as amateur speculation or family gossip. Over the past 6 months, I explained, pointing to the clear visual evidence on screen, Sophie pressured our parents to withdraw $43,000 from the wedding fund that Michael and I had established for this reception. The money was transferred directly to cover Sophie's credit card debts, unpaid rent, and outstanding loans that she had been hiding from everyone. The bank statements appeared with surgical precision, each transaction highlighted and explained with the kind of detail that would satisfy auditors or legal investigators. Several guests were taking photographs of the financial evidence, recognizing its significance, even as they struggled to process the magnitude of the betrayal it revealed. Sophie convinced our parents that the wedding expenses were lower than expected, and that I wouldn't notice the missing funds because of my supposedly limited income. I continued watching faces throughout the ballroom register shock and disgust at the calculated nature of the theft. What she didn't know was that my company's accounting team monitors all my personal finances as part of our standard executive protection protocols. Robert Chen stood up from his seat at the head table, his presence immediately commanding attention from the 200 guests who recognized him as one of the most respected investors in the city. "I can provide some additional context that might be helpful," Robert said, his voice carrying the authority of someone whose word carried weight in business circles throughout the region. 6 months ago, Sophie Chen approached our investment firm requesting a personal loan of $50,000. She claimed to be Emily's business partner and suggested that our existing relationship with Emily's company made us natural lenders for her expansion plans. The revelation sent another wave of shocked murmurs through the ballroom as guests realized that Sophie had been actively attempting to exploit Emily's business success for her own financial gain, while simultaneously planning to destroy her reputation. "When we investigated her claims," Robert continued, "we discovered that Sophie had significant outstanding debts with multiple creditors, a history of defaulted payments, and no legitimate connection to Emily's business operations. We declined the loan and reported the attempted fraud to our legal team." The professional testimony from someone of Robert's stature provided independent confirmation that Sophie's financial desperation had been driving her behavior for months before the wedding conspiracy began. It also established that her attempts at deception extended far beyond family manipulation into actual criminal fraud attempts. The debt investigation my company conducted reveals that Sophie currently owes money to 17 different creditors. I explained as the screen displayed a comprehensive breakdown of her financial obligations. The total amount exceeds $90,000, including significant sums owed to Marcus Thornfield's business associates, which explains why he was willing to help orchestrate this elaborate revenge scheme against my success. The financial web that connected Sophie's desperation to Marcus's revenge became clear as the evidence showed payments from Sophie to Marcus's associates, followed by agreements to provide services that included corporate espionage against my company and character assassination at my wedding. The paper trail revealed a conspiracy that went far beyond family jealousy into organized financial fraud and business sabotage. Sophie's debts to Marcus's network created leverage that he used to recruit her as an ally in his campaign against my business. I explained, watching the 200 guests absorb the full scope of what they were witnessing. She wasn't just jealous of my success, she was financially obligated to help destroy it. The presentation concluded with a timeline that showed how Sophie's mounting debts had coincided with increasingly desperate attempts to access money through family manipulation, fraudulent loan applications, and finally the elaborate wedding sabotage that was supposed to discredit me professionally while providing cover for additional theft. As the final charts faded from the screen, the ballroom fell into the kind of heavy silence that follows the revelation of crimes that extend far beyond personal betrayal into actual criminal activity. The 200 guests were no longer watching family drama. They were witnesses to evidence of fraud, theft, and conspiracy that would likely result in legal consequences for everyone involved. The ballroom doors burst open as the fired business partner enters with legal documents facing the 200 stunned wedding guests. Marcus Thornfield strode into the ballroom with the confidence of someone who believed he was arriving to witness my complete destruction, his expensive suit and legal documents creating an imposing presence that immediately drew the attention of all 200 guests. But as his eyes swept across the room and took in the projection screen, still displaying Sophie's financial crimes, the security footage of their conspiracy meetings, and the faces of guests who were clearly not witnessing my humiliation, his expression shifted from satisfaction to confusion to something approaching panic. "Marcus," My mother gasped, rising from her seat with obvious relief. "Thank God you're here. Emily has been lying about everything and turning people against us with fake evidence." But instead of the support she expected, Marcus's presence triggered the final revelation that would complete the picture of betrayal I had been building throughout the evening. My grandmother stood slowly from her seat at the head table, her voice carrying across the silent ballroom with the authority of someone who had been waiting 78 years to speak this particular truth. "Everyone should know exactly who Marcus Thornfield is before he starts making accusations." Grandma Rose announced her words, immediately capturing the complete attention of the 200 guests. "He's not just Emily's former business partner. He's also the man who destroyed my daughter's first marriage 25 years ago." The gasp that went through the ballroom was audible as guests processed the implications of what my grandmother was revealing. Marcus wasn't just a disgruntled former employee seeking revenge. He was my mother's former lover, whose affair had broken up her sister's marriage and torn apart the extended family decades before I was even born. "That's right." My grandmother continued, her voice steady, despite the emotional weight of what she was sharing. "Marcus had an affair with my daughter while she was married to her first husband, destroying her sister's family and causing a rift that never healed. And now he's back using Sophie's debts and desperation to manipulate this family into destroying Emily because he can't stand that she succeeded where he failed." The revelation transformed the entire context of the conspiracy as guests realized they were witnessing not just family betrayal, but the culmination of a decades-old revenge plot that connected Marcus's professional grudge against me to his personal history of destroying the women in my family. My mother's face went ashen as she realized that her shameful secret was being exposed to everyone who mattered in her social circle, but it was Marcus's reaction that confirmed everything my grandmother had just revealed. His confident demeanor crumbled as he understood that his carefully constructed image as a wronged business partner was being stripped away to reveal him as a serial manipulator who targeted vulnerable women for personal gain. "You have no right to bring up ancient history," Marcus snarled, but his words only served to confirm the truth of my grandmother's accusations. "That has nothing to do with Emily's business fraud and deception." But my mother's composure was collapsing under the weight of public exposure, and what came next destroyed any remaining credibility she might have retained with the horrified guests. "I'm sorry," my mother sobbed, her voice breaking as she addressed the ballroom full of people who had known her for decades. "I helped Sophie hide her debts because Marcus said he could help her if we just did this one thing to bring Emily down to earth. I knew it was wrong, but Sophie was in so much trouble and Marcus promised he could make it all go away if we just showed everyone that Emily wasn't as perfect as she pretended to be." The confession was devastating in its completeness, revealing not just her participation in the conspiracy, but her willingness to sacrifice one daughter's happiness to protect another daughter's financial irresponsibility. The 200 guests listened in horrified silence as she continued speaking each word further, destroying the maternal image she had cultivated over decades of community involvement. "I gave Sophie the money from the wedding fund because Marcus said Emily would never notice since she was just a secretary." My mother continued through her tears. "And when that wasn't enough, I helped them plan the wedding sabotage because Marcus convinced me that Emily needed to be taught a lesson about humility and knowing her place." The guests' outrage was palpable as they absorbed the full scope of the betrayal they had witnessed. This wasn't just wedding day drama or sibling rivalry, it was systematic emotional abuse orchestrated by people who should have been protecting and supporting me, instead of conspiring to destroy me at the most important moment of my life. "How could you do this to your own daughter?" Victoria Hartwell asked, her voice carrying the moral authority of someone who had built her career on principles of integrity and fair dealing. "Emily has accomplished something extraordinary, and instead of being proud of her success, you've spent months plotting to tear her down." The condemnation from respected community members was swift and unanimous, with guests expressing their disgust at the depth of corruption and betrayal they had been forced to witness. Marcus's presence had been intended to provide the final blow against my credibility, but instead it had triggered revelations that exposed the full scope of the conspiracy against me. Sophie whispers desperately to Mother, "If he tells them everything, we'll be ruined in front of everyone." Sophie's desperate whisper to our mother was overheard by several guests sitting nearby, and I watched as the realization of her complete exposure settled over her like a suffocating blanket. The ballroom had become a social disaster zone for her, with 200 witnesses who had seen her sabotage attempt backfire spectacularly and heard irrefutable evidence of her manipulation theft and betrayal of everyone who had trusted her. The immediate social consequences began even before she could fully process what had happened to her carefully constructed image. I could see guests throughout the ballroom pulling out their phones not to capture more photos of my successful dress transformation, but to document Sophie's meltdown and share their shock at what they had witnessed with their own social networks. Her college roommate Jessica, who had been one of Sophie's bridesmaids at her own wedding 2 years earlier, was typing furiously on her phone with an expression of disgusted betrayal. Within moments, I could see notifications appearing on other guests' phones as Jessica's post about Sophie's calculated manipulation and family betrayal began spreading through their shared social circles. "I can't believe I defended her when people said she was jealous and manipulative," Jessica said loudly enough for nearby tables to hear. "She's been lying about Emily for years, and now we know why. She's a fraud and a thief who was willing to destroy her own sister's wedding day." The condemnation spread through the ballroom like wildfire as other guests began sharing their own stories of Sophie's questionable behavior over the years. Incidents that had seemed like minor social awkwardness or harmless gossip were suddenly being reinterpreted as evidence of a pattern of manipulation and dishonesty that extended far beyond tonight's conspiracy. Among the 200 guests were several local society reporters who covered high-profile social events for regional magazines and newspapers. I could see them interviewing guests and taking notes about what they had witnessed, their professional instincts recognizing that they had stumbled onto a story that would generate significant reader interest. Amanda Chen, a lifestyle reporter for the city's premier society publication, was already on her phone with what appeared to be her editor describing the evening's events, in terms that suggested she understood the viral potential of the story she had just witnessed. "This isn't just wedding day drama," I heard her saying. "This is a documented case of attempted sabotage by someone who was systematically stealing from her own family while trying to destroy her sister's business reputation. The evidence presentation was more thorough than most corporate fraud investigations I've covered." The story was already taking on a life of its own as guests shared photos and videos from the evening across multiple social media platforms. The contrast between my triumphant dress transformation and Sophie's desperate meltdown provided exactly the kind of dramatic visual narrative that social media algorithms were designed to amplify. Sophie seemed to realize that her social destruction was accelerating beyond her ability to control it, and she began moving toward the ballroom exit with the frantic desperation of someone trying to escape a burning building. But her path to the door required walking past tables full of guests who had just watched her attempt to humiliate me in the most cruel way imaginable. The silence that followed her movement was more damning than any verbal condemnation could have been. 200 people who had known her for years were looking at her with expressions ranging from disgust to pity to outright contempt, and not one of them offered her a word of support or understanding. "Excuse me," she whispered to guests at a table near the exit, trying to squeeze past them with some semblance of dignity and tact. But even this simple request for passage became another moment of humiliation, as the guests deliberately avoided making eye contact or acknowledging her presence in any way. Her white dress, which had been intended to draw attention away from me throughout the evening, had become a symbol of her calculated attempt to overshadow her sister's wedding day. Now it served as a beacon that ensured every guest in the ballroom could track her shameful retreat from the scene of her failed conspiracy. As Sophie reached the ballroom doors, her composure finally collapsed completely. The tears she had been fighting back throughout the evening began flowing freely, as she realized that her reputation, her social standing, and her relationships with everyone who mattered in her life had been destroyed in a single evening of spectacular miscalculation. But even her emotional breakdown became another source of public humiliation as photographers who had been documenting the wedding's dramatic events turned their attention to capturing her exit from what should have been a celebration of her sister's happiness. Camera flashes light up the ballroom as photographers capture Sophie's tearful exit, ensuring her humiliation becomes permanent public record. Part 22. Community Rally Around Emily. The camera flashes that documented Sophie's humiliating exit were just the beginning of what would become a social media phenomenon that transformed my wedding from a private family event into a viral success story that reached far beyond the 200 guests who had witnessed it firsthand. Within hours, hashtags like #BrideRevenge and #WeddingJustice were trending as people shared and discussed the dramatic events that had unfolded at Malibu Estate. The story that emerged on social platforms wasn't focused on family drama or personal revenge, but on the inspiring narrative of a young woman who had built a successful business while facing systematic undermining from the people who should have been supporting her. Comments poured in from entrepreneurs, business leaders, and working women who saw my story as validation of their own struggles against family members or colleagues who had tried to diminish their achievements. "This is what happens when you underestimate a CEO," read one post that had been shared thousands of times, accompanied by photos of my dress transformation and the financial evidence I had presented. Emily Chen didn't just defend herself, she gave a masterclass in strategic planning and crisis management. The business community's response was immediate and overwhelming. Victoria Hartwell had posted a professional endorsement on LinkedIn within an hour of leaving the reception, describing my handling of the crisis as executive leadership of the highest caliber, and announcing that Hartwell Industries was interested in expanding our partnership into new markets. Robert Chen followed with his own post praising my extraordinary demonstration of grace under pressure and strategic thinking that would impress any boardroom, along with an invitation for other investors to consider partnership opportunities with my company. But it was the response from respected community leaders among the wedding guests that provided the most satisfying validation of what I had accomplished. Dr. Patricia Williams, the university president who had attended as Michael's family friend, approached me near the end of the reception with an offer that took my breath away. "Emily, I've been watching young entrepreneurs for 30 years, and I've never seen anyone handle a crisis with more intelligence and composure," she said, her words carrying the weight of institutional authority. "I'd like to discuss having you speak at our business leadership conference next spring. What you demonstrated tonight is exactly the kind of strategic thinking we want our students to learn." Similar offers came from other guests throughout the evening, invitations to join nonprofit boards, requests for consulting partnerships, and expressions of respect from business leaders who had previously seen me only as Michael's fiancé rather than as a professional equal worthy of their attention. The contrast between the community's embrace of my success and their rejection of my family's behavior was stark and immediate. I watched from across the ballroom as my parents found themselves increasingly isolated with former friends and business associates, making excuses to avoid conversation or simply walking away when approached. My father's golf partners, who had been friendly and jovial during the cocktail hour, were now treating him with the kind of polite distance reserved for people whose character had been fundamentally called into question. The real estate clients who had provided much of my parents' social circle were clearly reconsidering their relationships with people who had proven capable of such calculated cruelty toward their own daughter. My mother's situation was even worse as the women's organizations and charity boards, where she had held leadership positions, began receiving calls from members who had witnessed her confession of participating in the conspiracy against me. The social standing she had spent decades building was crumbling as word spread through the community about her role in the wedding fund theft and sabotage plot. The transformation was visible in real time as guests who had greeted my parents warmly at the beginning of the evening were now avoiding eye contact and finding reasons to leave conversations whenever they approached. The social isolation they were experiencing was complete and immediate, a natural consequence of behavior that had violated fundamental community standards of family loyalty and parental protection. As the reception began winding down and guests prepared to leave, I noticed several people checking their phones with expressions of surprise and curiosity. The viral nature of the wedding story was continuing to evolve, with new details and perspectives being shared across multiple platforms by people who hadn't even attended the event but had been captivated by the dramatic narrative. Michael showed me his phone screen, where notifications were appearing every few seconds as our wedding story continued spreading through social media networks. The comments were overwhelmingly supportive, with hundreds of people praising my handling of the situation and expressing admiration for my business success. But it was the final notification of the evening that suggested the story was far from over, as an anonymous account posted a cryptic message that immediately began generating speculation and discussion among followers of the viral wedding drama. An anonymous social media post promises to reveal even more shocking secrets about Sophie's hidden debts and affairs. The anonymous social media post promising additional revelations about Sophie's secrets created a buzz of anticipation among the remaining guests. But it was the response from established community institutions that truly solidified my transformation from family disappointment to respected business leader. As word spread beyond the ballroom about what had transpired at my wedding, the phone calls and messages began arriving from organizations that had never acknowledged my existence before tonight. The first call came from Margaret Sullivan, president of the Regional Chamber of Commerce, who had witnessed the evening's events as a friend of Michael's family. She approached me near the gift table with the kind of respectful demeanor she typically reserved for the city's most successful entrepreneurs. "Emily, I've been in business leadership for 25 years, and I've never seen anyone handle a crisis with more professionalism and strategic thinking." She said, her words carrying the weight of institutional recognition. "I'd like to formally invite you to join our board of directors and consider being our keynote speaker at the annual Leadership Summit. What you demonstrated tonight is exactly the kind of executive capability our members need to see." The invitation represented more than just professional recognition. It was admission into the inner circle of business leadership that had been closed to me as long as I maintained the fiction of being a simple office worker. Within minutes of Margaret's offer, similar invitations began arriving from other community leaders who had been present to witness my vindication. Father Rodriguez from St. Catherine's Church, where my parents had been prominent members for 15 years, approached with an expression that mixed admiration with disappointment as he looked toward where my parents sat in isolated shame. "Emily, your demonstration of grace under such terrible circumstances reflects the kind of character we hope to instill in our young people," he said quietly. "I would be honored if you would consider speaking to our youth group about entrepreneurship and maintaining integrity in the face of adversity. Your parents have been pillars of this church for years, but what they did to you tonight goes against everything we teach about family love and support." Nate. The moral condemnation from religious leadership was particularly devastating for my parents, who had built much of their social identity around their standing in the church community. I could see my mother's face crumble as she overheard Father Rodriguez's words, realizing that even their spiritual community would not support their betrayal of their own daughter. But it was my grandmother's announcement that provided the most meaningful validation of the principles I had tried to embody in both my business and personal life. She rose slowly from her seat at the head table, her voice carrying across the ballroom with the authority of someone who had earned the right to speak about character and integrity through decades of consistent action. "I want everyone here to know something about my granddaughter that she's too modest to share herself," Grandma Rose announced, immediately capturing the attention of every remaining guest. "For the past 3 years, Emily's company has been quietly funding full scholarships for underprivileged children to attend college. She's never sought recognition for this work, and she's never used it for publicity or tax advantages." The revelation sent a wave of surprised murmurs through the ballroom as guests processed this additional dimension of my character. The scholarship program had been one of my most carefully guarded secrets, something I had established through a separate foundation to ensure it couldn't be connected to my business for promotional purposes. "Emily inspired me to establish my own charitable foundation," my grandmother continued. and I've been working with her team to identify deserving students who might otherwise never have the opportunity to pursue higher education. We've funded 18 full scholarships so far, and every one of those students knows they can succeed because someone believed in their potential. The standing ovation that followed was different from the applause that had greeted my dress transformation or business revelation. This was recognition of character that went beyond professional success into the realm of moral leadership and community service. Even guests who had initially seemed skeptical about the evidence I had presented were now looking at me with genuine respect and admiration. The contrast between the community's embrace of my values and their rejection of my family's behavior became more pronounced as the evening concluded. I watched my father approach several of his longtime business associates, only to be met with polite but firm rejection as they made excuses to avoid conversation. "I'm sorry, but I don't think we can continue our partnership after what we witnessed tonight." I heard Tom Morrison tell my father, his voice carrying the finality of a business relationship that would not survive the reputation damage. "Betraying your own daughter for money isn't the kind of character we want associated with our firm." The pattern repeated itself throughout the ballroom as former friends and professional contacts distanced themselves from people who had proven capable of such calculated cruelty. My mother's attempts to explain or justify their actions fell on deaf ears, as guests made it clear that there was no acceptable excuse for what they had done. The charitable organizations where my mother had held leadership positions were already beginning to distance themselves from the scandal. I overheard phone conversations where board members discussed removing her from committees and reconsidering her involvement in fundraising activities that required public trust and moral authority. "We can't have someone representing our children's charity who was willing to steal from her own daughter's wedding fund," one woman said loudly enough for my mother to hear. "How can we trust her with donor money when she can't be trusted with her own family?" The social isolation my parents faced was complete and immediate, extending beyond personal relationships into professional consequences that would affect their livelihood and community standing for years to come. They had gambled their reputation on destroying mine, and they had lost everything in the process. As the last guests began preparing to leave, I noticed my father checking his phone with an expression of growing alarm. The color drained from his face as he read whatever message had just arrived, and I saw him show the screen to my mother with shaking hands. Their final humiliation was approaching, and even I hadn't anticipated how complete their destruction would become. The consequences they faced extended far beyond social embarrassment, into legal territory that could threaten their freedom as well as their reputation. The fired partner sends a threatening text to Emily's father. "Pay me what Sophie owes or I'll tell the police about the fraud." Marcus's threatening text message had transformed my parents from defiant conspirators into desperate people facing the collapse of everything they had built over decades of careful reputation management. As the last guests filtered out of the ballroom expressing their support for me and their disgust at what they had witnessed, I noticed my parents hovering near the gift table with the anxious energy of people who needed to have a conversation they dreaded. My father approached first, his face showing an emotional vulnerability I hadn't seen since childhood, when he would apologize after particularly harsh criticism of my dreams and aspirations. But even in his apparent contrition, I could see the calculating desperation of someone who viewed this conversation as a negotiation rather than a genuine attempt at reconciliation. "Emily, we need to talk," he said quietly, glancing around to ensure that Michael and my grandmother were occupied with other guests. "What happened tonight got out of hand, and I think we all said and did things we regret. But we're still family, and family should stick together when outside forces try to tear us apart." The attempt to frame Marcus as an outside force rather than their chosen ally was so transparently manipulative that I felt a moment of pity for how completely my father had lost touch with reality. They had recruited Marcus, coordinated with him, and willingly participated in his revenge scheme, but now that the consequences were arriving, they wanted to position themselves as his victims rather than his collaborators. My mother joined the conversation with tears in her eyes that appeared genuine, though I suspected they were motivated more by fear of social and financial ruin than by actual remorse for the pain they had caused me. "Emily, sweetheart, I know we made mistakes tonight," she said, reaching for my hand with the kind of maternal gesture she had rarely offered during my childhood. "But you have to understand that we were worried about you. Sophie convinced us that you were hiding things from us, and Marcus made it sound like you were involved in something dangerous or illegal." The attempt to shift responsibility onto Sophie and Marcus while portraying themselves as concerned parents was breathtaking in its dishonesty, especially given that 200 witnesses had heard recordings of them enthusiastically planning my humiliation with obvious malicious intent. "We never wanted to hurt you," my father continued, his voice taking on the pleading tone of someone who desperately needed me to believe what he was saying. "We just thought you needed to be more honest with your family about what you were really doing. But now we understand that you built something amazing and we're proud of you." And the conditional nature of their pride was exactly the kind of manipulation I had been subjected to throughout my childhood, but experiencing it as an adult with the confidence that came from genuine professional success made me see it clearly for what it was. "What we need to do now is present a united front," my mother said, her voice growing more urgent as she sensed my skepticism. "You have influence with important people now, and you could help us manage this situation before it gets worse. If you use your business connections to contain the story and frame tonight as a misunderstanding, we could all move forward as a real family." The proposal they were making was clear. They wanted me to use the professional reputation and relationships I had built to clean up the mess they had created through their own choices. They were asking me to sacrifice my credibility and integrity to protect them from the consequences of their betrayal, and they expected me to do it in exchange for the promise of family acceptance they had withheld my entire life. "You could tell people that the recordings were taken out of context, or that the financial documents don't tell the whole story." My father suggested, his desperation becoming more obvious as he outlined what amounted to a cover-up strategy. "Your business partners would believe you, and the social media attention would die down if you just explained that this was all a family misunderstanding that got blown out of proportion." I looked at these two people who had shaped my childhood with their constant criticism and conditional love, who had spent months planning to humiliate me at my wedding, who had stolen money meant to celebrate my marriage, and who were now asking me to lie to protect them from accountability for their actions. The sadness I felt wasn't for the relationship we were ending, but for the relationship we had never been able to build because they had never been willing to see me as someone worthy of unconditional love and support. "Real family means loyalty and support," I said calmly, my voice carrying the quiet authority I had developed through years of difficult business negotiations. "I've built my own family through my business and my marriage with people who believe in me and stand by me even when things get difficult." The words hit them with the force of a final judgment, and I watched my mother's face crumble as she realized that the daughter she had tried to control and diminish had grown into someone who no longer needed their approval or acceptance. "Emily, please," she whispered, but I could see in her eyes that she already understood my answer. "I'm genuinely sorry that your choices have led to these consequences." I continued maintaining the compassionate but firm boundaries that had served me well in business relationships with difficult clients or partners. "But I won't sacrifice my integrity or my relationships with people who respect me to help you avoid accountability for what you chose to do." My father's face hardened as he realized that the manipulation tactics that had worked on me as a child were powerless against the woman I had become. "You're making a mistake," he said, his voice carrying a threat that might have intimidated me years earlier, but now seemed pathetic and empty. "Family is supposed to forgive and forget, not hold grudges that destroy relationships forever." "You're right that family is supposed to forgive," I replied, "but forgiveness doesn't mean enabling destructive behavior or pretending that serious betrayals didn't happen. I forgive you for the pain you caused me, but I won't help you escape the consequences of choices you made as adults." The conversation was interrupted by a commotion near the ballroom entrance that drew the attention of everyone still present at the reception. Through the ornate glass doors, I could see several uniformed police officers approaching with the purposeful stride of people who were there on official business rather than responding to a routine disturbance call. Police officers appear at the venue entrance, their serious expressions indicating the legal consequences are about to begin. The police officers entered the ballroom with the kind of professional composure that immediately commanded attention from every remaining guest, their presence transforming what had been a private family confrontation into something with serious legal implications. The lead detective, a woman in her 40s with graying hair and intelligent eyes, surveyed the scene with the practiced assessment of someone who had investigated countless cases of fraud and conspiracy. Marcus Thornfield, who had been trying to maintain his composure despite the evening's revelations, went visibly pale as he recognized that his threatening text message to my father had apparently triggered consequences he hadn't anticipated. The confident demeanor that had carried him through years of business dealings evaporated as Detective Martinez approached him with handcuffs already in her hand. "Marcus Thornfield, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, extortion, and corporate espionage," she announced in a voice that carried clearly across the silent ballroom. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." The words seemed to break whatever psychological barrier had been holding Marcus together throughout the evening's disasters. As the handcuffs clicked into place, he began speaking with the desperate fluency of someone who understood that cooperation might be his only hope of avoiding maximum penalties. "Sophie Chen orchestrated the entire scheme," he said, his voice carrying clearly enough for the remaining guests to hear every word. "She approached me 6 months ago with information about her sister's business and suggested we could work together to bring Emily down. I provided the intelligence and planning, but Sophie recruited her parents and coordinated all the family elements of the conspiracy." The confession was more comprehensive than I had expected, revealing details about the collaboration that went beyond what even my evidence had captured. Marcus described how Sophie had provided him with personal information about my relationships and business practices, how she had convinced our parents to participate by framing the sabotage as necessary family intervention, and how the financial theft had been her idea to fund both her debts and his revenge operation. Emily's father helped launder money from the wedding fund to cover Sophie's gambling debts and credit card payments, Marcus continued, as Detective Martinez took notes. He used his real estate business accounts to make the transfers look legitimate, but all the documentation is in his office files. The implications of Marcus's confession sent a wave of shocked whispers through the remaining guests, as they realized the conspiracy had involved not just personal betrayal, but serious financial crimes that could result in prison sentences for everyone involved. My mother's reaction was immediate and devastating. She collapsed into a chair near the gift table, her composed social facade crumbling completely as she understood that the legal consequences Marcus was describing would destroy not just her reputation, but potentially her freedom. "I didn't know it was illegal," she sobbed, her words barely coherent through her panic. "Sophie said it was just family money, and Marcus told us that Emily was hiding assets and income that belonged to all of us. I thought we were just teaching her a lesson about honesty." The attempted justification only made her situation worse, as Detective Martinez wrote down every word, creating an official record of admissions that could be used as evidence in the prosecution that was clearly coming. But it was Sophie's reaction that provided the most dramatic moment of the entire evening. The moment she heard Marcus implicating her as the conspiracy's architect, she bolted from her position near the ballroom exit and ran toward the parking lot with the desperate speed of someone who believed she could still escape the consequences of her actions. 2 additional officers had been positioned outside, and I watched through the ballroom's floor-to-ceiling windows as they intercepted Sophie before she could reach her car. The struggle that followed was brief but intense, with Sophie screaming accusations and denials that could be heard even through the closed doors. "Emily planned all of this," she shrieked as the officers restrained her. "She set us up to make herself look good. She's the criminal, not me." The irony of her accusations was lost on no one. Sophie was essentially confessing that there had indeed been a plan to harm someone, while simultaneously revealing that she viewed Emily's success as a crime that deserved punishment. As the immediate drama of the arrests unfolded, my phone buzzed with a notification that provided a perfect counterpoint to the chaos surrounding my family's downfall. The message was from my company's senior partner in Singapore, and the subject line made my heart race with excitement despite everything else that was happening. Congratulations, Emily. The Chen Group has approved our expansion proposal, and we've just signed the largest international consulting contract in our company's history. The 3-year agreement is worth $12 million and positions us as the primary strategic advisor for their North American operations. The timing was almost surreal while my family faced arrest and social destruction. For their attempts to sabotage my success, my business was achieving the kind of breakthrough that most entrepreneurs only dream about. The contract represented not just financial security, but validation from one of Asia's most respected business conglomerates that my company had earned a place among the industry's elite firms. Michael, who had been watching the police arrests with obvious shock, noticed my expression change as I read the message. When I showed him the screen, his face broke into the kind of proud smile that reminded me why I had fallen in love with him in the first place. $12 million, he whispered, shaking his head in amazement. Emily, do you realize what this means? While they were trying to destroy your career, you were building something they could never even imagine. The contrast between my professional triumph and my family's legal disaster was so stark that it felt like a scene from a morality tale about the consequences of jealousy and betrayal. As Marcus and my parents were led away in handcuffs, their futures uncertain and their reputations destroyed, I was receiving confirmation that my business had reached a level of success that placed it among the most respected consulting firms in the international market. But as I stood there processing the magnitude of both my victory and my family's defeat, I caught sight of movement in the parking lot that sent a chill down my spine despite the warmth of my professional triumph. Through the ballroom window, Emily spots Sophie standing in the parking lot staring back with pure hatred and mouthing, "This isn't over." Sophie's threatening message from the parking lot lingered in my mind for only a moment, before I made a conscious decision to focus on the people who remained in the ballroom. Guests who had witnessed something extraordinary and were now looking at me with the kind of respect and admiration I had spent years earning in boardrooms, but had never expected to receive from my personal community. The arrests and legal consequences had cleared the air of toxicity, leaving behind an atmosphere of celebration and genuine joy that felt like the wedding reception I had originally dreamed of having. David Kim. Understanding that the evening needed a positive shift in energy, began playing soft music that invited conversation and reflection rather than the dramatic tension we had all experienced. The remaining 50 or so guests, rather than being eager to leave after witnessing such intense family drama, seemed drawn to stay and be part of what felt like a historic moment. The transformation of someone they had known as a quiet office worker into a respected business leader who had demonstrated extraordinary grace under pressure. Victoria Hartwell approached me with a champagne flute and a smile that carried genuine warmth alongside her professional admiration. "Emily, I've been to hundreds of business events and corporate celebrations, but I've never seen anyone handle a crisis with more dignity and strategic thinking than you demonstrated tonight," she said, raising her glass in a toast that several other guests immediately joined. "To Emily Chen, entrepreneur leader, and an example of what it means to succeed with integrity." The spontaneous toast that followed felt different from the earlier applause that had greeted my evidence presentation or business revelation. This was recognition not just of my professional achievements, but of my character and the values that had guided my response to an unprecedented personal attack. Even guests who had initially been skeptical about the family conflict were now participating in the celebration with obvious sincerity and respect. It was Michael who provided the evening's most moving moment when he stood and asked for everyone's attention, holding the letter I had written to him the night before. His hands shook slightly as he unfolded the pages, and I could see the emotion in his eyes as he prepared to share something deeply personal with people who had just witnessed the most difficult night of our relationship. "Last night, Emily wrote me a letter that I think everyone should hear." He began, his voice carrying clearly across the now quiet ballroom. She was trying to explain why she had kept her business success secret, and what she wrote captures everything I love about the woman I married today. As he began reading my words aloud, I felt a mixture of vulnerability and pride that I had never experienced before. The letter had been written in a moment of fear and uncertainty, but hearing it read in this context transformed it into something closer to a declaration of values and principles. She wrote, "I have been hiding my success not out of dishonesty, but out of a desperate desire to protect both my business and our relationship from people who would try to destroy what we've built together." Michael read, his voice growing stronger as he continued. "What she demonstrated tonight is that sometimes protecting the people you love means having the courage to reveal the truth, even when that truth changes everything." The response from the guests was immediate and emotional, with several people wiping their eyes as they absorbed the significance of what they were hearing. This wasn't just a love story. It was a testament to the kind of partnership that could survive deception crisis and public humiliation while emerging stronger than before. But it was my grandmother's contribution to the evening that provided the most meaningful conclusion to what had been an extraordinary night of revelation and triumph. She rose slowly from her seat, her presence commanding attention through sheer moral authority rather than volume or dramatic gesture. "I want everyone here to understand something about my granddaughter that goes beyond her business success or even her courage tonight." She began, her voice carrying the weight of decades of wisdom and observation. "Emily's company has been quietly funding college scholarships for underprivileged children for the past 3 years, and she inspired me to establish my own foundation to continue this work." The revelation sent a wave of surprised murmurs through the remaining guests, many of whom were learning for the first time about the charitable work that I had deliberately kept private to avoid any appearance of seeking publicity or recognition for acts that should be motivated by genuine compassion rather than business advantage. "We've been working together to identify deserving students who might otherwise never have the opportunity to pursue higher education." My grandmother continued, her voice growing more emotional as she spoke. "Every scholarship recipient knows they can succeed because someone believed in their potential, and Emily taught me that the most meaningful success comes from lifting others up rather than tearing them down." The standing ovation that followed was different from any applause I had received throughout the evening. This was recognition of values that transcended business success or personal vindication, acknowledgement of character that had been demonstrated through actions rather than words over a period of years, rather than a single dramatic evening. As guests began approaching me individually to express their admiration and respect, I found myself thinking about how completely my life had changed in the span of a few hours. I had entered the ballroom as someone trying to hide her true identity, and I was ending the evening as a person whose character and accomplishments were being celebrated by an entire community. The transformation felt surreal, but it also felt earned through years of hard work, ethical business practices, and the kind of character development that had prepared me to handle the evening's challenges with dignity and strength. I was no longer the uncertain young woman who had doubted whether she deserved success, but someone who had proven she could create value for others while maintaining her integrity under the most difficult circumstances imaginable. As the evening wound down and guests began saying their final farewells, expressing their gratitude for being witnesses to something they clearly viewed as inspiring and historic, I noticed Amanda Chen, the lifestyle reporter who had covered the evening's events, approaching with her notebook and a determined expression. A business journalist among the guests approaches Emily. "The world needs to hear your story. What message do you want to share?" Amanda Chen approached me with the professional confidence of someone who recognized that she was witnessing a story that would resonate far beyond the society pages where she typically worked. Her question about what message I wanted to share with the world carried the weight of someone who understood that the evening's events had created a platform for something larger than personal vindication or business success. I looked around the ballroom at the remaining guests who had stayed to witness this final chapter of what had been the most transformative night of my life. These weren't just wedding attendees anymore. They were people who had seen someone overcome systematic betrayal through preparation, integrity, and strategic thinking, rather than revenge or cruelty. Their faces showed the kind of respect that comes from witnessing character under pressure, and I realized that my response to Amanda's question would be heard by far more people than just those present in this room. Success comes from standing up for truth, and real family consists of people who believe in your dreams. I said, my voice carrying clearly across the ballroom to ensure that every remaining guest could hear what I hoped would be my lasting contribution to the evening's narrative. For too many years, I allowed other people's limitations to define what I thought was possible for my own life. I built my business in secret because I was afraid that people who claimed to love me would try to tear down what I was creating. The silence that followed was complete and attentive, the kind of focused listening that happens when people recognize they are hearing something that speaks to their own experiences and struggles. Tonight taught me that when you have the courage to reveal your authentic self, you discover who truly deserves a place in your life. I continued feeling the weight of wisdom that had been earned through years of careful choices and tonight's ultimate test of character. The people who celebrate your success and stand beside you during crises are your real family, regardless of their last name or biological connection to you. Amanda was writing furiously in her notebook, but I could see that several other guests were recording my words on their phones, recognizing that they were hearing something that would be shared and discussed long after tonight's events became community legend. I want other entrepreneurs, especially young women, who might be hiding their ambitions to avoid criticism or sabotage, to understand that your dreams deserve protection and pursuit. I said, thinking about all the scholarship recipients who would benefit from the foundation work my grandmother and I had established. But the best protection comes from surrounding yourself with people who want to see you succeed and having the courage to distance yourself from those who don't. The applause that followed felt different from the earlier ovations. This was acknowledgement of universal truths that extended far beyond my personal story into principles that could guide anyone facing similar challenges in their own lives. Michael stepped beside me and took my hand. As the applause faded, his presence a living example of the kind of partnership I had described. Together, we thanked the remaining guests for their witness and support, expressing gratitude for their role in transforming what could have been a devastating humiliation into a celebration of values and character. As we prepared to leave for the honeymoon trip to New Zealand that would mark the beginning of our married life, I felt a sense of completion that went beyond personal victory. My business was thriving with the new international contract that positioned us for unprecedented growth. My reputation in the community had been transformed from that of a quiet office worker to a respected entrepreneur and person of integrity. Most importantly, I had discovered the strength to choose my own family based on love and mutual support rather than obligation and manipulation. The drive to our hotel felt like a victory lap through a life that had been fundamentally changed in the span of a single evening. Michael and I talked quietly about the future we would build together, the expansion plans for my business, and the charitable work that would allow us to create positive impact beyond our own success. But as we walked through the hotel lobby toward the elevator that would take us to our honeymoon suite, my phone buzzed with a message that reminded me that not all consequences of the evening's events were necessarily positive. The message was from Janet Morrison, my company's cybersecurity specialist, marked with the high-priority encryption that indicated potential security concerns requiring immediate executive attention. Emily, congratulations on your wedding and the Singapore contract. However, we've received several new investment inquiries over the past few hours that appear to be connected to tonight's viral social media coverage. Most are legitimate, but our monitoring systems have flagged someone who has been asking very detailed questions about Sophie and your family background, rather than focusing on business metrics. The message continued with technical details about IP addresses and query patterns that suggested coordinated information gathering, rather than genuine investment interest. Janet's analysis indicated that someone was using the attention surrounding my wedding story to conduct what appeared to be intelligence gathering about potential vulnerabilities in my personal or professional life. The inquiries are sophisticated enough to suggest professional investigation rather than casual curiosity. Recommend we discuss enhanced security protocols when you return from your honeymoon. Also advising all staff to report any unusual contact attempts related to family matters or requests for personal information about company leadership. I showed the message to Michael, who read it with growing concern as he understood the implications of what Janet was describing. Our moment of triumph was being shadowed by the possibility that tonight's victory had created new threats that we hadn't anticipated. As we entered our suite and I moved toward the window to close the curtains before settling in for our first night as a married couple, I caught sight of movement in the hotel parking lot that sent a chill down my spine despite the warmth of the evening's success. In the distance, Sophie stands alone in the shadows, speaking into her phone. "She destroyed my life. Now I'll destroy everything she's built." And there you have it. The incredible story of Emily Chen, a woman who turned what should have been her most humiliating moment into her greatest triumph. From the moment she overheard her family plotting against her 1 week before her wedding to the spectacular dress transformation that left 200 guests in awe to the final revelation of her multi-million-dollar business empire, Emily proved that intelligence, preparation, and integrity will always defeat jealousy and betrayal. This story shows us that sometimes the people who are supposed to love us most can become our biggest obstacles. But it also demonstrates the power of building your own chosen family with people who genuinely support your dreams and ambitions. Emily's journey from hiding her success to proudly revealing it reminds us that we should never dim our light to make others comfortable, especially when those others are actively working to tear us down. The revenge Emily achieved wasn't about cruelty or getting even. It was about standing up for truth and refusing to be victimized by people who underestimated her capabilities. Her parents, Sophie and Marcus, all learned the hard way that when you try to destroy someone who has quietly built an empire, you might just find yourself facing consequences you never saw coming. But perhaps the most satisfying part of this story is how Emily's victory extended beyond personal vindication to create positive change in her community. Her charitable work, her business success, and her demonstration of grace under pressure inspired others and earned her the respect she had always deserved but never received from her own family. Of course, with Sophie's ominous final threat suggesting the story might not be completely over, we can only wonder what other challenges Emily might face as she navigates her new life as a publicly successful entrepreneur. Will Sophie find new ways to strike back? How will Emily's business continue to grow now that her secret is out? And what will happen when the full legal consequences of the conspiracy finally play out in court? If you enjoyed this incredible story of wedding day revenge and want to hear more tales of people who turned their biggest challenges into their greatest victories, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss a new story. We love sharing these inspiring accounts of people who refuse to be defeated by those who tried to bring them down. What did you think of Emily's handling of the situation? Do you think she was too harsh on her family, or did they get exactly what they deserved? And what would you have done if you discovered your own family plotting to humiliate you at your wedding? Share your thoughts in the comments below because we read every single one and love hearing your perspectives on these dramatic stories. Don't forget to give this video a thumbs up if Emily's story inspired you to think about the importance of surrounding yourself with people who believe in your dreams rather than those who try to limit your potential. And if you know someone who needs to hear this message about standing up for themselves and not hiding their light, share this video with them because sometimes we all need a reminder that our success is worth fighting for. Thanks for joining us for this incredible journey of family betrayal, spectacular revenge, and ultimate triumph. Remember to subscribe for more amazing stories, and we'll see you in the next video, where we'll explore another fascinating tale of people who refused to let others define their limits.